Hello, friend. Settle in. Get comfortable. Because tonight we're stepping into England in 1540, into the home of a woman who was neither serving girl nor duchess, but the wife of a baron, running a household of 40 people almost entirely alone while her husband served 40 miles away at a court that could turn dangerous overnight. Under the law of her time, she held almost no property of her own, and yet by dawn she carried the keys to every store, every strongbox, and every locked door in the house. Her mornings began behind heavy curtained beds in rooms with no real privacy at all. Getting dressed took the better part of an hour and required 2 other women's hands. And in the private chapel where she prayed each day before anything else, the old certainties of the church were quietly, carefully changing around her. We'll come across details like these tonight, slowly, one at a time, folded into the story of one particular woman's very ordinary, quietly extraordinary morning. Just a small moment before we begin. If these gentle evenings have become a comfort to you, subscribing would mean more than you know, and if tonight helps ease your mind towards sleep, really does keep this little channel going. Tell me in the comments where you're curled up tonight, maybe with the heating humming low somewhere in Minnesota, or under a cool breeze somewhere in the English countryside. All right, love, let's begin. It is not yet 5 o'clock in the morning, and the house is silent in the particular way that only a great house in the middle of winter can be silent. A silence with weight to it, as though the cold itself has settled into the stone and is pressing everything else into stillness. Somewhere below, in a kitchen you cannot yet hear from here, a fire has already been coaxed back to life. But in this room, high above the hall, nothing has moved for hours except the occasional collapse of an ember in the small hearth, and the slow, private breathing of 2 women in the dark. You might think, if you pictured the wife of a wealthy landowner in the year 1540, of a woman lying in comfort, waited on, cushioned from the world by wealth and rank, and in a way you would not be wrong. But comfort in a Tudor manor house did not mean warmth, not really, not at 5 in the morning in January, and it certainly did not mean privacy, and it did not mean rest for as long as the body wanted it. It meant something narrower. It meant that when the cold did come, as it always did, there would be linen against her skin instead of coarse wool, and someone within arm's reach to help her face it. Let me introduce you to her properly. Her name does not matter so much as what she carries. She's close to 30 years old, married for over a decade now to a baron whose family has held this land for 3 generations, a man currently 40 miles away at court, where he has been for the better part of 2 months, and where he will likely remain for 2 more. She is this morning the only person in this house whose decisions actually govern anything, not in name only, in practice. The steward answers to her, the kitchen answers to her, the nursery, the accounts, the sick woman in the laundry house with a fever that has not yet broken, all of it, this morning, answers to her. There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes from being responsible for a great deal, while also being expected to appear, at every hour, as though it cost you nothing. I think you would recognize that feeling actually, even now, even in your own very different life. That specific exhaustion of holding everything together while looking, to anyone watching, entirely unbothered. She does not know yet that this morning will include a letter she has been half dreading for 3 weeks. She does not know that a messenger left London before dawn, and is, at this very moment, somewhere on a frozen road with her name folded into his coat. She only knows right now in this dark room that it is time to wake up and that she has not chosen this hour. Nobody in this house, however grand its title, gets to choose the hour the body must rise in January. The curtains go first. That is how it begins, every morning of her married life, in one form or another. The bed she sleeps in is not simply a bed the way you might picture one. It is a room within a room, a heavy oak frame hung on all 4 sides with thick woolen curtains, sometimes lined further with fur in the deepest part of winter, drawn shut each night to trap in whatever warmth the body and the low fire can produce between them. Inside those curtains, the air is close and human, and almost tropical compared to what waits beyond them. It smells of wool, of the lavender laid among the linens months ago. Her attendant, a gentlewoman named Joan who has slept on a low trundle bed pulled out from beneath the great bed itself, is the one who moves first, Not a servant of the lowest rank, understand, but not quite family either. A woman of good but lesser standing, placed in this household years ago by an aunt who thought the position would serve her well, and who has slept within reach of her mistress every night since, because that is simply what the arrangement requires. There is no version of privacy here that you or I would recognise. A noblewoman of this rank is almost never fully alone, not sleeping, not dressing, not eating. Solitude, as a thing to be sought and enjoyed, barely exists as a concept for her. It would have struck her, I think, as a slightly sad and friendless way to live, rather than a luxury. Joan swings her legs down onto the floor, feels for her slippers in the dark, and crosses to the window first, not the bed. There is a ritual to this. The heavy inner shutters are unbarred, though the thick glass beyond them, itself, a mark of real wealth in this house, still shows nothing but blackness and a faint smear of frost at the corners. Only then does she come back to the bed and draw the near curtain open, letting the cold air of the room pour in through the gap like water finding a crack. I want you to feel this moment the way she does. There is a half second, right at the edge of sleep, where the warmth is still complete, where the body has not yet registered what is coming, and then it arrives, all at once, the particular bite of a January morning in an English manor house with no fire built up yet, air that has been sitting untouched and unheated for 6 or 7 hours, air that seems to find every gap in the blankets immediately and settle directly against the skin. She sits up. Whatever dream she was having, if she was having one, is gone now. Her feet find the edge of the mattress. Below them, the floor is not bare stone, thankfully, but strewn rushes mixed with dried herbs, sweet woodruff mostly, refreshed by the chambermaids only 4 days ago, and beneath that a scattering of woven rush matting near the bed itself, to soften the very worst of the cold underfoot. It helps. It does not solve the problem. Nothing solves the problem of a stone-built house in January. Not entirely. Not even wealth. That is a detail I think people forget when they picture this life. Money bought you better cold. It did not buy you warmth the way a modern radiator would. Reaching for the fur-lined wrap laid across the foot of the bed the night before, she, exactly where it always is, because exactness is one of the quiet luxuries of a well-run household. Someone thought last night about what her body would need in this exact moment, and prepared it. That is worth noticing, I think. So much of wealth in this period was not objects at all. It was other people's foresight, purchased and organised in advance, so that the wealthy person's own morning felt, if not warm, at least anticipated. The small fire in the hearth, banked down to embers overnight, gets its first attention now. Joan crouches before it with a set of iron tools, breaking apart the ash-covered coal at the centre to expose the orange beneath, feeding in kindling first, then a split log, coaxing rather than forcing, because a fire built too fast in a cold flue will smoke the whole room out before it warms it. It will be another 20 minutes before that fire does anything more than glow. For now, it is a small, hopeful sound in the corner of a dark room more promise than heat. There is a chamber pot, of course, kept behind a low folding screen near the far wall. Plain wood and linen, nothing decorative about it, because some things about a body do not change no matter how many titles precede your name. I mention it only once, and only because I think honesty matters more than a falsely polished picture of the past. By candlelight now, a single tallow candle at first, its light thick and a little smoky, and nothing at all like the clean glow you might imagine. She moves to the small table near the window, where a ewer of water has been left the night before, close enough to the fire's old heat to keep it from freezing outright, though it is still, this morning, uncomfortably cool against the skin. Joan pours a little into a shallow basin. There is a linen cloth soft from repeated washing, and a small hard cake of scented soap, made in this house's own still room from tallow and ashlie and dried rose petals folded in near the end for scent, because a great household of this kind did not buy such things from outside if it could make them better and cheaper within its own walls. She washes her face first, then her neck, then her hands, working the cloth in slow circles the way she was taught as a girl, water and soap and then a second cloth, dry, to finish. It is not a bath. Full bathing is a rare, deliberate event in this household, planned around a wooden tub and hours of hauled and heated water, not a daily habit, and certainly not something attempted on a January morning before dawn. But this daily washing is thorough in its own smaller way, unhurried despite the cold, because appearance and cleanliness are, for a woman of her rank, a form of duty rather than vanity. A noblewoman who appeared unkempt reflected badly not on herself alone but on her husband's household, on his judgment, on the whole careful architecture of the family's reputation. Vanity would have been the wrong word for it entirely. It was closer to armour. Her teeth she cleans with a small linen cloth wrapped around one finger, rubbed with a little salt and sometimes a paste of crushed cuttlefish bone and a slender green twig from a hazel branch, its end chewed soft to work between the teeth. It is not so different, in its basic logic, from what you did before bed tonight, I would guess, even if the tools themselves would look strange in your bathroom. Joan combs out her hair next. A long ivory comb works slowly from scalp to end, pulling free the single strands that gather in it and tucking them, out of habit more than superstition, into a small cloth pouch rather than simply thrown to the floor, since loose hair carelessly discarded was thought, in some households, to invite bad luck if a bird carried it off to build a nest. I find that detail genuinely delightful, honestly. Not because I think it is true, because of what it tells you about how closely watched every small habit of a Tudor household could be, how much unspoken meaning got folded into gestures that looked, on the surface, like nothing at all. Her hair itself, once combed, is not left loose. Not this morning, not any morning past girlhood. It will be gathered and pinned close to the head shortly, in preparation for whatever head covering the day's clothing requires, because loose, uncovered hair on a grown, married woman was simply not done, not in public, not even within the walls of her own house once the day had properly begun. It signalled something her rank could not afford to signal casually. And here is the thing about all of this: the washing, the combing, the careful attention to a body most of the household will never see uncovered. None of it is really about vanity in the way we might use that word now. It is about control, about presenting, every single day without fail, a version of herself that says everything is managed, everything is in order, this house has not slipped, even though her husband is 40 miles away, and there is a fever in the laundry house, and a letter somewhere on a frozen road with her name on it that she does not yet know exists. Before anything else happens in this house today, though, before the first real decision gets made or the first servant gets given an instruction, there is somewhere she goes first, every morning, without exception. The private chapel sits at the end of a short gallery on this same floor, a small stone room barely larger than the bedchamber itself, cold in the particular way that stone rooms without their own hearth are always cold, colder even than the bedroom she has just left. There is a plain altar along the far wall, a kneeling cushion worn thin in the centre from years of exactly this use. A small window of leaded glass that lets in nothing yet but darkness. A single candle burns here too, already lit by the time she arrives because someone, again, thought ahead. She kneels. Joan kneels a little behind her and to the side, close enough to be present, far enough to leave the moment feeling as much as anything in this house ever does like her own. I want to sit with this for a moment, because I think it is easy to rush past prayer in a story like this, to treat it as a formality, a box ticked before the real business of the day. It was not that. For a woman in 1540 England, prayer at the start of the day was not separate from the responsibilities that followed. It was the frame that made sense of them. Everything she was about to do, manage the accounts, discipline a servant, decide what her daughter would eat and wear and learn today, all of it was understood as stewardship under a larger authority, not simply her own preference exercised for its own sake. There is something else here too, something quieter and a little harder to name, and I do not want to overstate it, because her private uncertainty is not something the historical record hands us directly, but it is worth knowing the shape of the world she's praying inside of. England in 1540 is a country in the middle of enormous religious upheaval. Her father's generation prayed one way, with one set of certainties, one Latin liturgy, one understanding of what a chapel and a priest and a candle before an altar actually meant. Her own generation is watching those certainties get reorganized, sometimes gently, sometimes with real violence elsewhere in the country, by decisions made in London and by the king himself, a king her husband serves and depends on for his very land. Her household chaplain, an older man named Father Whitmore who has served this family for 11 years, still says the daily office much as he always has, but there have been small, careful changes even here, in this small stone room. Certain books that once sat openly on the shelf beside the altar have been quietly moved. Certain saints' days are observed with a little less public ceremony than they once were, not abandoned exactly, just handled with more caution, the way you might handle a subject at a family dinner that used to be simple and is not simple anymore. She does not discuss this with anyone, not even Joan, not really. It sits underneath the mourning the way the cold sits underneath the rushes on the floor, present, managed, not spoken of directly. What she does know, with complete certainty, is what her prayers this morning need to include. Her husband, travelling and at court, where a wrong word or a misjudged alliance could cost a family everything it has built across 3 generations. Her children, both here in this house under her direct care. The woman with the fever in the laundry house, whose name is Marjorie, and whose condition Joan mentioned to her only briefly last night, in that careful, unworried tone servants use when they do not yet want to alarm you, but think you should know. She prays for perhaps 10 minutes, unhurried despite the cold stone floor beneath the cushion, and then rises, and the day, in its practical sense, properly begins. Getting dressed, for a woman of her rank, is not something she does. It is something done to her, with her cooperation, by 2 pairs of hands working in a practiced order that has not changed in years. The first layer is the simplest and in its way the most important. A linen smock, soft and much washed, worn next to the skin beneath everything else, changed daily, because linen next to the body was understood, correctly as it happens, as the real foundation of cleanliness in this period. You did not bathe every day. You changed your linen every day, or as close to it as circumstances allowed, and that habit did most of the practical work that a daily bath would do for you now. It is a detail I think surprises people when they first hear it. The Tudor solution to hygiene was not dirtier than ours. It was simply organised around a different tool. Over the smock come the stockings, knitted wool, held up above the knee with a garter tied simply and practically, rather than decoratively, because no one but Joan, and perhaps a lady's maid, will ever see this part of the process. Then a pair of soft leather shoes, low and simple, meant only for indoor wear on these cold floors, kept separate from the sturdier outdoor pair, waiting near the door for when she eventually crosses the courtyard. Then the petticoat, a warm quilted underskirt, sometimes more than one layered together in the depths of winter, providing both shape and, honestly, a good deal of the actual warmth that will get her through a cold house all day. I think this detail matters more than people usually credit. All that fabric was not only about appearance. Layered wool and linen were, quite literally, this century's version of central heating, worn directly on the body rather than pumped through the walls. Over the petticoat comes the kirtle, a fitted underdress, often laced up the front or the back depending on the cut, that shapes the torso and provides the structured base the outer gown will sit over. Joan works the laces now, standing behind her, pulling them snug but not painfully so, checking the fit against a body she has dressed 1,000 mornings before this one, and knows, at this point, almost better than her mistress knows it herself. I should say something here about the farthingale, because it is one of those garments people picture incorrectly, imagining something enormous and cage-like from later in the century. In 1540, the farthingale worn in an English household like this one is a more modest thing, a stiffened underskirt, shaped with graduated hoops of cord or reed sewn into channels, giving the outer gown a smooth, structured bell rather than the dramatic wide shape that would come decades later under Elizabeth. It is practical shaping more than spectacle, though it does, I will admit, make sitting down an act that requires a small amount of learned technique rather than simple habit. Now the gown itself, the outer layer that anyone beyond this room will actually see. Today it is a deep dark wool, close in colour to a rich forest green, chosen partly for the season and partly because dark, saturated colours of this quality were themselves a quiet display of wealth. Cheap dyes faded quickly and unevenly. A dye this deep and this even, held fast through repeated wear, told anyone who looked closely that the household could afford both the finest dyers and the discipline to have the cloth handled properly. Fashion in this world was never separate from finance. Every visible choice was also a kind of ledger entry, whether anyone said so aloud or not. The sleeves are a separate piece entirely, pinned on rather than sewn permanently, which allows a single gown's body to be paired with different sleeves for different occasions, a small practical economy hidden inside what looks, from the outside, like pure ornament. Today's sleeves are fuller through the upper arm, narrowing at the wrist, finished with a cuff of contrasting fabric, a soft grey fur trim just visible at the edge, because the room beyond this one, however carefully heated, will still be cold enough to make that small extra warmth genuinely welcome, rather than merely decorative. Joan pins the bodice front closed, small metal pins worked precisely along the front seam, a process that will need checking and repinning at least once before the morning is over, because pins worked loose with movement, and a gown that gaped open at the front by midday was the kind of small failure a woman of her position simply could not afford to let happen in front of a visiting neighbour or a servant with a loose tongue. Last comes the head covering, and here I think is where the smallest choices carried the most weight. A married woman of her rank did not appear in public, and rarely even within her own hall, with hair fully visible. Today she wears a simple linen coif close against the head, and over that a gable hood, its stiffened front frame shaped into the distinctive angular arch that marks this particular decade of English fashion, black fabric falling in soft folds down the back and sides. It takes real skill to set correctly, and Joan adjusts it twice before she is satisfied, checking the angle against the light from the now properly built-up fire. And then, finally, the jewellery. Not much, not this early, not for an ordinary working morning rather than a feast or a visit from someone whose opinion mattered enormously. A simple gold ring on her right hand, a small pendant on a fine chain tucked mostly beneath the neckline of the gown, present more as a quiet certainty than a display. She will add more, later, if the day calls for it. For now, this is enough. This is the version of herself that manages an estate, checks accounts, and walks a cold gallery before the rest of the household has finished its own breakfast. The whole process, start to finish, has taken the better part of 40 minutes. Neither of them has hurried it, and neither of them would think to call it slow. This is simply what a morning requires, when the morning belongs to someone whose appearance is, itself, a form of work. Below her, unheard from this height but entirely felt in the running of the house, the kitchens have been awake far longer than she has. They light the great kitchen fire hours before the family's day properly begins, sometimes as early as 3 in the morning in winter, because bread does not bake itself, and a household of this size, family, chaplain, steward, gentlewomen, grooms, kitchen staff, stable hands, laundresses, gardeners, easily 30 or 40 mouths on an ordinary day, and considerably more when guests are present, needs its ovens working long before anyone upstairs opens their eyes. I will not spend the whole morning down there with you, because this story belongs to her, not to the kitchen, but I want you to hold the sound of it in the back of your mind as we go, a low, constant hum of work beneath everything else that happens today, the thud of dough being turned, the particular smell of a bread oven just coming up to heat, dry and mineral before it turns warm and yeasted, a boy hauling water from the well in the dark, breath clouding in front of him, moving quickly because standing still in that cold is worse than the work itself. When she finally sits to eat, in a small private chamber just off the great hall, rather than in the hall itself, which is reserved for larger, more formal meals later in the day, the meal itself is modest by the standards you might expect from a household this wealthy. Bread first, a good white loaf made from finely bolted wheat flour, the kind of bread that itself marked status, since the coarser, darker bread made from unsifted grain was what the lower servants ate below stairs. Butter, made in this house's own dairy 2 days before. A small cut of cold meat left from the previous evening's supper, mutton most likely, sliced thin, perhaps a little cheese if the season and the dairy's output allow it generously. And to drink, small beer, a low-alcohol brew made specifically for daily drinking rather than intoxication, safer in practice than the well water in many households of this period, and weak enough that a grown woman could drink it at breakfast without a second thought. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think popular imagination sometimes runs away with this detail. This is not the enormous, groaning, meat-laden breakfast table you might picture from a costume drama. That kind of elaborate spread belonged to feast days, to formal dinners at midday or early evening, to occasions built specifically around display. An ordinary Tudor morning meal, even in a wealthy household, was comparatively simple, practical fuel to start a long working day, not a performance in itself. The performance came later, at dinner, when the hall filled and the household's wealth was meant to be seen. There are fasting days too, worth mentioning briefly. Days when meat is set aside entirely in favour of fish, eggs and dairy, a rhythm still observed in this house, following the church calendar, the way most English households still did in 1540. Whatever quiet uncertainties were beginning to gather around other parts of religious practice. Today happens not to be one of those days. Today there is mutton on the table, and she eats it without particular ceremony, her mind already moving ahead to the accounts waiting for her in the small room behind the hall. The small room behind the hall is hers alone, as much as any room in this house can be called that. A single narrow window, a plain oak table, a heavy locked chest along one wall, and on a cord around her waist, tucked beneath the fold of her gown, a ring of keys that never leaves her person, not during the day, not while she sleeps, not for any reason short of illness severe enough to hand the household's operation to someone else entirely. I think the keys are worth pausing on, actually, because they tell you something the fine clothing does not. Fine clothing tells you what other people are meant to see. The keys tell you what she is actually responsible for. There is a key for the linen store, where the household's considerable stock of sheets, tablecloths and towels is kept, itself a substantial investment requiring careful counting and mending and rotation so that no single set wore through before its replacement was ready. A key for the spice cupboard, since spices, pepper and cinnamon and dried ginger and sugar refined enough to use at table were expensive enough to be locked away as carefully as coin, doled out by her own hand or under her direct instruction rather than left for the kitchen staff to use freely. A key for the small strong box where the household's ready coin is kept for daily expenses, separate from her husband's larger holdings and investments, which are managed at a different level entirely, mostly by correspondence with his steward in London. She sits now with the steward of this house, a careful, unhurried man named Thomas Aldwyn, who has served the family for nearly 20 years, and who brings her every morning at this hour a running account of exactly what the household has consumed, purchased, repaired, and required in the day just past. Firewood consumption, checked against the woodpile's dwindling stock, and the question of whether more needs cutting before the roads become impassable with the next hard frost. Candles, both the cheaper tallow kind burned freely throughout the servants' quarters, and the finer beeswax kept for the family's own rooms and for the chapel, counted and rationed with real care. Because beeswax candles were genuinely expensive, and a household that burnt them carelessly was a household quietly announcing either poor management or reckless spending, neither of which reflected well on a family's standing. There is a question of the roof over the eastern wing, where a leak discovered during last week's rain has left a stain spreading slowly across the plaster ceiling of a guest chamber, and Thomas has already spoken to a local craftsman about the repair, but the cost needs her approval before the work can begin, since anything beyond routine maintenance requires a decision she alone, in her husband's absence, is positioned to make. She asks 2 or 3 sharp, practical questions, the kind that come from genuinely understanding how a roof and its repair actually work, rather than simply nodding along, and gives her approval. Wages need considering too. Quarter day still some weeks off, but a new stable hand recently taken on, whose pay needs settling against the household's other running costs, and a dispute, small but requiring her attention nonetheless, between 2 of the kitchen staff over a missing piece of pewter that has since turned up, mercifully, in a cupboard where it had simply been misplaced rather than stolen, though the accusation itself has left some tension lingering between the 2 women involved that Thomas suggests, gently, she might want to address directly rather than leave to fester. This is the part of the morning, I think, that surprises people most when they hear it laid out plainly. The image most of us carry of a wealthy woman in this period, decorative, sheltered, largely ornamental, simply does not match the reality of what actually kept a great household functioning. She is this morning doing something closer to what we would now call running a mid-sized business with a staff of dozens, a physical plant that requires constant maintenance, a supply chain dependent on seasons and weather and trustworthy merchants, and a set of financial decisions that carry real consequences if handled poorly. The only difference is that no one, including her, would ever have used that language to describe it. It was simply what a wife of her rank did. It was simply the work. When Thomas has gone, taking his ledger and his careful, methodical voice with him, there is a gap of perhaps 20 minutes before the next demand on her morning, and into that gap comes something softer, something that changes the temperature of the room even before anyone speaks. Her daughter, 7 years old, is brought in by her own nurse, already dressed, hair already pinned, because children of this household do not appear before their mother in disarray any more than the household's linen appears unmended. Her son, 3 years older, has already been handed off to his tutor for the morning, a young clergyman engaged specifically for the purpose, who will spend the hours until midday walking him through his Latin grammar and the rudiments of arithmetic, subjects considered essential preparation for a boy who will, in time, be expected to manage estates, correspond with lawyers and stewards, and hold his own in conversation with men considerably better educated than most of the country. She will not see him again until the household gathers for dinner, and she thinks of him only briefly now, a small, warm certainty in the back of her mind, rather than an active concern. A different matter entirely arrives with her daughter this morning, a different kind of education besides. She settles the girl beside her at the small table, and for perhaps a quarter of an hour, mother and daughter work through a sampler together, small, careful stitches in coloured silk thread forming letters and simple patterns along a strip of linen, the kind of exercise that will, over years, teach the girl not just needlework itself, but patience, precision, and the particular kind of quiet attention a household of this rank expected from its women. Reading comes too, a little, from a small devotional book kept for exactly this purpose, though her daughter's education will never run as deep or as formal as her brother's. That is simply the shape of things in 1540. A daughter of this rank is being prepared for a different future, marriage into another good family, the management of another household much like this one, and the skills she is taught reflect that future directly. I do not want to rush past this too quickly, because there is something genuinely tender in it, watching a mother correct her daughter's stitching with the same patient, unhurried attention she gave the accounts an hour before, the same care she will give the steward's next report an hour from now. It is all, in its way, the same kind of work, managing, teaching, holding a household together thread by thread, decision by decision, so that it looks from the outside effortless. There is a moment, small and easy to miss, where her daughter asks when her father is coming home, and she answers honestly that she does not know exactly, only soon, and there is a flicker of something crossing her face before she smooths it away again, something that has nothing to do with the sampler in front of them, and everything to do with a court 40 miles away, where fortunes rise and fall on the king's mood, and a single misjudged word. The messenger arrives a little before 9, mud splattered to the knee, his horse blowing hard in the courtyard below, and word of his arrival reaches her before he does, carried up by a breathless kitchen boy who clearly considers this the most interesting thing to happen all morning. She receives him in the hall itself this time, standing rather than seated, because a letter from London carried this urgently deserves that much formality, even at 9 in the morning with her hair still slightly damp at the temples from the cold of the chapel. He hands over a sealed packet, her husband's own hand visible in the direction, and she thanks him, sees that he has given food and a place by the kitchen fire to warm himself before his return journey, and then, only then, alone again breaks the seal. I am not going to tell you exactly what the letter says, not yet, because I think some things are better sat with slowly than announced all at once, and there is a version of this morning that unfolds more gently if we let this particular thread breathe a little before we come back to it. What I will tell you is that it is not bad news, not the kind she has been quietly bracing for these last 3 weeks. It is something closer to uncertain news, the kind that requires more waiting rather than less, and there is a particular flavour of exhaustion that comes from bracing yourself for a blow and receiving, instead, only the instruction to keep bracing a while longer. You understand, I think, without my needing to explain it in great detail, that 1540 is not a comfortable year to have a husband at court. This is the year Thomas Cromwell, the king's most powerful minister for the better part of a decade, will fall with a speed that leaves half of England's noble households recalculating their alliances overnight. It is the year the king's brief marriage to Anne of Cleves will be quietly, awkwardly undone within months of the wedding. It is a year, in short, where proximity to royal favour is less a comfort than a live coal, warm and valuable as long as you hold it correctly, and capable of doing real damage the moment your grip slips. Her husband holds no grand office, nothing so exposed as Cromwell's position. He is a landowner with useful connections and a reasonable reputation, present at court partly out of genuine duty and partly because a family's standing, once built, requires constant careful tending, or it begins, slowly, to erode. But even a modest presence at court in this particular year means watching which way the wind is blowing before you speak, means knowing which old friendships have become, overnight, dangerous to be seen maintaining, means understanding that the ground beneath everyone's feet has become, in a very real sense, unstable. She folds the letter and tucks it into the pocket sewn inside her gown, rather than leaving it on the table, and if you watched her closely in this moment, you might notice that her hands are perfectly steady and her face gives away almost nothing at all, and I think that steadiness is, itself, one of the most quietly impressive things about her. Nobody taught her that particular skill in a formal lesson. She learnt it the way you learn most things that matter, slowly, through repetition, through years of practicing calm in rooms full of people who were watching to see whether she would show any. By mid-morning the house has fully woken around her, and the nature of her attention shifts again, from the private concerns of accounts and letters toward the more public business of a household that exists, in part, to project stability outward to everyone who depends on it. 2 tenants arrive together shortly after 10. Farmers who hold land under her husband's estate come to petition over a boundary dispute between their 2 holdings that has apparently simmered since the autumn harvest and finally boiled over into something requiring the lady of the manor's direct attention rather than being settled quietly between themselves. She hears them out in the hall, standing near enough to the fire to keep the worst of the cold off, but not so close as to seem to be favouring comfort over the seriousness of the matter, and I find something genuinely admirable in how she handles this. She does not simply defer the decision until her husband's return, though she could, and many women of lesser confidence in her position might have. She listens carefully to both accounts, asks pointed questions about an old hedge line that seems to be the actual root of the disagreement, and proposes a solution, a walk of the boundary together with the steward present to mark it clearly and permanently, that satisfies neither man completely, but seems, from the slightly relieved set of both their shoulders as they leave, to satisfy them enough. This is authority exercised quietly, without any of the ceremony you might expect from the word itself. No raised voice, no dramatic pronouncement, just a woman who has clearly done this before, who understands both farming and human pride well enough to find a solution that lets both men walk away without feeling they have lost. There is a purchase to approve as well, a quantity of salt fish needed to see the household through the coming Lenten season, its price negotiated already by Thomas but requiring her final agreement before the order is confirmed with the merchant, and a question of hospitality to settle too, since word has come that a neighbouring family, the Ashcombes, whose eldest son is being quietly considered as a possible future match for her own daughter some years from now, though nothing so formal as an actual arrangement yet exists, may pass this way within the fortnight, and might reasonably expect to be received with proper warmth should they choose to break their journey here. She gives instructions accordingly, which rooms should be prepared, which of the better linens brought out, what might reasonably be offered at table without appearing either stingy or extravagant, because hospitality, like clothing, was never simply generosity for its own sake. It was calculation, dressed in warmth. Between these larger matters, smaller ones thread through constantly, the way small things always do in a house full of people. A question about whether the laundress with the fever, Marjorie, needs a physician sent for, or whether the household's own still-room remedies, a warm posset of ale and herbs, rest and careful watching, will see her through, and she decides, after asking a few careful questions of the housekeeper, that watching a little longer costs nothing, and a physician's visit, expensive and not always more effective than good sense and rest, can wait until tomorrow if the fever has not broken. A brief exchange with the gardener about which of the kitchen garden's stored roots have begun to spoil in the cold store and need using before they are wasted entirely. A moment, almost too small to mention, where she notices a torn hem on one of the hall's window curtains and simply makes a mental note to have it seen to, the way you might notice, without quite meaning to, a small imperfection in your own home that nobody else has spotted yet. There is a stretch of the late morning, once the tenants have gone and the day's more pressing decisions have been made, where the pace of the house softens just slightly, and she allows herself perhaps half an hour in the long gallery that runs the length of the house's upper floor, a space built partly for exercise on days too cold or wet for walking outdoors, and partly simply for the pleasure of light and space in a house where most rooms are small, dark, and built more for warmth than for beauty. The gallery is different. Long windows run down one side of it, tall enough to let in real daylight even on a grey January morning, and she walks its length slowly, Joan a few steps behind her, not for any particular purpose beyond the walking itself, though her mind, even here, does not fully rest. Portraits of her husband's family line the inner wall, his grandfather, stern and formally posed, his own father, younger than she ever remembers him being in life, and she finds herself pausing, as she often does, before a small, unremarkable painting near the end, a modest landscape that belonged to her own mother and came to this house as part of her marriage goods over a decade ago now, one of the very few things in this entire grand house that is, in the smallest sense, purely hers rather than her husband's family's. I think that detail matters more than it might first appear. A woman marrying into a household like this one brought herself, certainly, her education, her connections, her dowry, but she rarely brought many physical things that remained recognizably her own once absorbed into a husband's household and a husband's name. This one small painting, unremarkable to anyone else who passed it, was a kind of anchor, a reminder, small and private, that she existed as herself before she existed as this house's mistress, and would, in some sense, continue to. Back in her own chamber a little later, before the demands of the midday meal begin to gather, she takes up needlework of her own, not the simple sampler she worked through with her daughter earlier, but a more ambitious piece, a cushion cover worked in silk thread depicting a pattern of vines and small birds, something she has been slowly building for months now, in whatever quiet half hours the day happens to offer. There is a particular kind of stillness in this work that I think is worth naming directly, because it stands in such contrast to everything else that has filled her morning. No decisions here, no consequences riding on a stitch placed slightly wrong. Just the slow, repetitive pleasure of a needle moving through fabric, thread by thread, colour by colour, a small private world entirely under her own control, in a life where so much, however competently managed, is not. A little music drifts up from somewhere below while she works. One of the household's musicians practicing on a lute in a room near the hall. Nothing formal, nothing performed for an audience, simply someone keeping their skill sharp against the day, weeks or months from now, when actual guests might require actual entertainment. She listens without quite meaning to, her needle slowing slightly in time with a melody she half recognizes, and there is a moment here, brief and easy to miss if you were not paying close attention, where the tension that has sat quietly beneath this entire morning, the letter in her pocket, the fever in the laundry house, the uncertain political weather her husband is navigating 40 miles away, seems to loosen just slightly, not resolved, just, for a few minutes, set down. Let me take you through the rest of this house properly now, slowly. the way she might if she were walking it herself on an ordinary morning, checking, as she does most days, that everything sits where it should. Past the hall, through a low doorway that requires even a woman of her modest height to duck slightly, lies the buttery, a cool, dim room lined with wooden casks and shelves, named not for butter itself but for the butts, the large casks of ale and wine that it exists to store and dispense. The household drinks a great deal of ale across a single day, small beer mostly for daily use as you already know, but also a stronger brew kept for the family's own table and for honoured guests, and wine besides, imported at real expense from France and Spain, kept here under lock in smaller quantities, brought out only for the finer meals, or when circumstances, a visiting family, a celebration genuinely call for it. The air in this room smells of yeast and damp wood, and something faintly sweet underneath, the smell of fermentation itself, which is not an unpleasant smell exactly, just a particular one, the kind that clings faintly to the clothes of whoever works in here regularly. Beside it, the pantry, drier and cooler still, where the household's bread is stored once baked and cooling, along with dried goods, flour, oats, dried peas and beans that will see the kitchen through the leaner months before the next harvest, and salted meat hanging from hooks set into the low ceiling beams, preserved through methods that have not changed much in generations, salt and smoke and careful timing standing in for the refrigeration you and I take entirely for granted now. There is something almost cathedral-like about a well-stocked pantry in a house like this one, rows and rows of provision laid up carefully against a future that has not arrived yet, a physical, tangible form of the same foresight that put her wrap at the foot of the bed last night and lit her chapel candle before she arrived. Further along, past the kitchen itself, with its heat and noise and the particular chaos of a dozen tasks happening at once, sits the still room, quieter, almost a small laboratory in its own right, where the household's soaps and scented waters, its simple medicines, its preserved fruits and cordials, are made under the close supervision of the housekeeper, a woman named Agnes, who has managed this particular room for nearly as long as Thomas has managed the accounts. It is here that this morning's soap was made weeks ago, here that the posset being prepared right now for poor Marjorie's fever is being mixed, warmed wine and herbs and a little honey, a remedy that has, in Agnes's long experience, worked more often than it has failed, though everyone in this house understands, without needing to say so aloud, that not every fever responds to warmth and rest and hope alone. Outside now, briefly, because the cold demands brevity even from a determined tour. The courtyard sits at the centre of the house's arrangement, cobbled and swept each morning despite the season, ringed by the working buildings that keep the estate functioning, stables where perhaps a dozen horses are kept, warm with animal breath and the smell of hay and leather, a small forge where the estate's own blacksmith keeps tools and horseshoes in repair, a dairy building set slightly apart for cleanliness, where two women are, at this very hour, working butter in wooden churns, with the same patient repetitive rhythm she herself brought to her needlework not an hour ago. And beyond the courtyard, the gardens, sleeping now under January's grip, bare hedges clipped into careful formal shapes that will not show their real intention again until spring. A kitchen garden further out where herbs and vegetables grow in warmer months, and somewhere past that, the orchard, bare branches against a grey sky, holding invisibly the promise of next autumn's apples and pears, the way the whole house, in its way, holds the promise of every season still to come. I find myself genuinely moved by this part of the house, honestly, more than I expected to be when I first started researching it. There is something in the sheer, patient organisation of it all, the way every single room exists in careful relation to every other room, the way nothing here is accidental, that speaks to a kind of collective human effort I do not think we picture clearly enough when we imagine the past. This was not one woman's achievement alone, it was dozens of people, dairymaids and stable hands, and a steward with a good memory for numbers, all working in a kind of quiet, unglamorous concert, so that a house could simply function, day after day, season after season, without anyone upstairs needing to think very hard about how it managed to. It will not always look like this, of course. This particular morning, this January cold, and this particular pattern of tasks is only one version of a life that shifts considerably with the turning of the year, and I think it is worth pausing here to let you feel that contrast properly, because it changes so much about how every single thing we have covered so far actually feels in practice. Come June, and the same room she woke in this morning, the same heavy curtained bed, will hold a very different kind of dark. Sunrise arrives absurdly early in an English summer, well before 4 in some years, and the cold that made this morning's curtain opening such a small, deliberate confrontation will simply not exist in the same way. Joan will still open the curtains at roughly the same hour, but what pours in will be pale golden light rather than a blade of winter air, and the whole rhythm of rising will feel, by comparison, almost gentle. The fire that took 20 determined minutes to properly warm this room this morning will barely need lighting at all in high summer, perhaps only enough for cooking rather than warmth. The layers of wool and quilted petticoat that gave her body its actual daily warmth today will be set aside in favour of lighter linen, and dressing itself, while no less elaborate in its structure of smock and kirtle and gown, will simply take less of a toll on a body that is not simultaneously fighting off the cold while doing it. Even the washing water will not carry that particular winter edge, sitting instead at something closer to genuinely pleasant against the skin. Household work shifts too, and shifts considerably. Summer brings the kitchen garden into full production, and with it a whole new category of daily decision: what to preserve, what to eat fresh, how to manage a sudden abundance of produce that will need turning into jams and dried herbs and stored goods before autumn arrives and takes it all away again. It brings haymaking, and, later, the harvest itself, the single most demanding stretch of the entire agricultural year, when every hand on the estate, and a good many hired beyond it, turns toward the fields, and her own morning becomes less about accounts kept quiet behind a locked door, and more about feeding, organising, and keeping track of a small army of harvest workers whose labour, more than almost anything else, determines whether the coming winter will be comfortable or genuinely difficult. I mention all this not to distract from the January morning we have been sitting inside together, but because I think it deepens the picture rather than complicating it. The rhythm of her days was never fixed. It breathed with the seasons, contracted in winter into small, careful indoor tasks close to the fire, and expanded in summer into something busier and more outward-facing and, in its own demanding way, considerably more physical. Wealth brought her comfort within each season. It did not exempt her from the season itself. There are other kinds of mornings too, mornings that would not look anything like this one, and I want to walk you through a few of them gently, because I think they tell you something true about how fragile and how variable a life like hers actually was, however sturdy it might appear from the outside on an ordinary day. Consider a morning much like this one, but with her body carrying a child, as it has 4 times already across her marriage, twice successfully through to a living child, and twice quietly not. A pregnancy in this period did not excuse a woman of her rank from the running of her household, not until the very final weeks, when she would withdraw into what was called her lying-in chamber, a room specially prepared, curtained heavily against light and draughts alike, where she would remain, attended almost entirely by women, for the final stretch before the birth, and for a period of weeks afterward besides. Before that final withdrawal, though, pregnancy simply folded itself into the existing rhythm of accounts and dressing and prayer, managed alongside everything else, perhaps with a little more rest permitted in the early afternoon, perhaps with certain foods avoided on the advice of the local midwife, but rarely, if ever, treated as a reason to step back from the responsibilities that defined her days. Picture, differently, a morning where it is not a servant's fever in the laundry house, but her own body that will not rise easily from the bed, some illness settled into her chest or her joints, and the whole household's rhythm bending, quietly and without drama, to accommodate it. Thomas would still come with his ledger, but the meeting might happen at her bedside, rather than in the small room behind the hall. Her daughter's lesson might be shortened or given over entirely to a nurse for the day. The visible authority of the household would not stop, exactly, but it would move, temporarily, closer to the bed, closer to the curtains that had, only that morning, been the site of her waking rather than her resting. And consider, further still, the morning that every woman in her position understood, without needing to dwell on it constantly, could arrive without warning. Widowhood would change everything about a morning like this one. not gradually but immediately. A widow of sufficient means, and standing in this period, held real, if complicated, legal and practical authority, the ability to manage her own dower lands, to make decisions no longer filtered through the shadow of a husband's absent authority, but standing entirely in her own right. It was not a fate anyone actively wished for, and it carried its own real vulnerabilities, questions of remarriage, questions of whether her husband's family would treat her fairly regarding property and her children's futures. But it was not, as popular imagination sometimes assumes, a fate of pure helplessness either. Some of the most capable estate managers in England during this century were widows who had simply continued, alone, the work they had already been doing for years. One more version of a mourning is worth naming here, rarer, more dramatic, and considerably more nerve-wracking than any of the others. A royal visit, should the king's own progress through the country ever bring him within reach of a house like this one, would transform every single element of what we have walked through this morning into something urgent and enormously consequential. The accounts, the linen, the kitchen stores, the very state of the roof over that eastern guest chamber, all of it would need to rise almost overnight to a standard capable of hosting not just a guest, but the single most powerful and most unpredictable man in the country, along with the considerable retinue that travelled with him. Households genuinely bankrupted themselves preparing for royal visits in this period, and the honour of hosting the king carried, always, an undercurrent of real financial and political danger alongside the prestige. It has not happened to this house, not yet, and she does not think it especially likely this year. But it is the kind of possibility that sits, faintly, at the edge of every noble household's awareness in a reign like this one, the way a distant weather system sits at the edge of a sailor's awareness even on a calm morning. There is a weight to being watched constantly that I do not think we always appreciate properly when we imagine a life like hers, and I want to sit with it directly for a few minutes, because it threads through absolutely everything we have covered this morning, without ever once being named outright. Her appearance, as we have already discussed, was never simply personal preference, but it went further than clothing and hair. The way she walked through her own hall mattered, unhurried, upright, never rushed even when genuinely pressed for time, because a mistress who appeared flustered signalled a household that was not fully under control. The way she spoke to servants mattered too, firm without cruelty, warm without familiarity that might undermine the necessary distance of rank, a balance that took years to calibrate properly, and that she still, honestly, found herself adjusting even now, over a decade into managing this particular household. Fertility itself, uncomfortable as it might feel to name so plainly, was itself a matter of public interest and private pressure in a way that had nothing to do with her own wishes on the subject. A marriage of this kind existed, in significant part, to produce heirs, to secure the continuation of a family's name and land across another generation, and a woman's worth within that marriage, however unfairly, was bound up with her ability to deliver on that expectation. She had, mercifully, 2 living children, a son to inherit and a daughter to marry well, and that fact alone had quietly settled a certain kind of anxiety that hung over many marriages of her rank in this period. Anxiety that never fully vanished, but that had at least softened considerably over the years. Obedience, too, though I want to be careful with that word, because I think it carries connotations now that do not map cleanly onto how it actually functioned then. She was not, in any meaningful daily sense, a woman without will or authority, as this entire morning has hopefully already shown you, but there was a formal structure of deference that shaped how that authority was expressed. Decisions made in her husband's name, even when made entirely by her own judgment, correspondence to him that framed her choices as reports rather than announcements, a careful public performance of a hierarchy that in the private daily reality of this house operated rather differently than its outward form suggested. It is a strange kind of balance to hold, competence exercised constantly, credit for that competence extended more carefully and more quietly. And beneath all of it, this year particularly, sat the quiet pressure of a court that had become, under this particular king, genuinely dangerous to misjudge. I do not want to overstate this into something it was not for a household like hers, comfortably positioned, but not desperately entangled in the very highest, most exposed circles of royal politics. She was not lying awake in terror most nights, but there was a background hum of caution that touched everything, which old family alliances were safe to maintain openly, and which had quietly become liabilities, which religious observances could still be practiced without a second thought, and which now required a small, careful pause before proceeding, which words, even within her own household, were safe to speak plainly, and which were better left unspoken, even among people she trusted. It was exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with physical labour, and everything to do with the slow, constant expenditure of vigilance, and I think, honestly, that particular kind of tiredness would feel familiar to you too, in your own very different life, in whatever version of careful watched performance your own days might sometimes require of you. By the time the bell in the small turret above the hall marks the approach of midday, the version of her that woke in the dark 4 hours ago, half-dressed, cold-footed, alone except for Joan and a low fire, has been replaced entirely by the version the rest of the household, and any visitor who might arrive, will actually see. She moves now toward the hall itself, where the household will gather shortly for the midday meal, the largest and most formal meal of the day, and there is a visible shift in her posture as she crosses that threshold, subtle but real, shoulders set a little straighter, pace a little more measured, the private woman folding herself carefully back into the public role that this house, this marriage, this whole particular arrangement of rank and duty requires of her. The hall itself is already being prepared, long trestle tables being set with the household's better linen for this larger gathering, the great salt cellar, an elaborate piece of silver that sits always at the head of the table and marks, quite literally, where rank divides, family and honoured guests above it, lesser household members and servants below, already placed carefully in its position by a manservant who has done this exact task every single day for years. I keep coming back to that salt cellar, actually, the more I think about this house, because it captures something I find genuinely fascinating about the period as a whole. A single object, silver and finely worked, sitting at the centre of a table, doing nothing more practically useful than holding salt, and yet organising, silently and completely, the entire social geography of every meal eaten in this hall. Nobody needed to announce where they were meant to sit. The salt cellar told them every single day without a word being spoken. She takes her place near the head of the table, in the seat that would, on an ordinary day with her husband present, sit slightly to his right rather than at its very centre. Today, in his continued absence, she occupies a position closer to that centre herself, another small practical adjustment that nobody in this household would think to remark upon directly, though everyone understands exactly what it means. The lady of the house is, this week and for some weeks still to come, standing in for more than her own role alone. The household files in gradually, Thomas the steward, Agnes the housekeeper, the chaplain Father Whitmore, her daughter brought down freshly by her nurse, her son released at last from his morning's Latin, gentlewomen and senior servants filling the tables below, according to that same quiet, salt-marked geography, and there is a particular kind of comfort, I think, in watching a household this large settle into a rhythm this practiced. Grace is said by Father Whitmore, brief and familiar, and then the meal itself begins, considerably more substantial than the morning's simple bread and cold meat, dishes carried in from a kitchen that has been working toward exactly this moment since 3 in the morning, the whole long invisible chain of labour we walked through earlier finally arriving, visibly, at a table. This particular meal unfolds slowly, the way meals in a household like this one always did, less a quick refuelling and more a structured, almost theatrical event with its own careful rhythm. A pottage comes first, a thick, warming stew of vegetables and barley, given real body today by a good measure of mutton broth, ladled out by a servant moving carefully down the table. Careful because a spilled bowl on good linen was the kind of small failure that would earn a quiet word later. Careful too simply because that is how you learnt to move in a house where every gesture, however small, was noticed by someone. After the pottage, roasted fowl, a brace of capons that Agnes had overseen in the kitchen since well before dawn, carved at the table by the household's senior manservant, with a confidence that comes from doing exactly this task several times a week for years, portions distributed according to that same quiet hierarchy the salt cellar had already established, the choicest cuts finding their way naturally toward the head of the table without anyone needing to instruct that they should, bread again, the good white loaf, and a dish of parsnips cooked soft in butter, and for the children, though not for the adults at this particular meal, a small sweetened custard that her daughter eyes with the kind of open, uncomplicated delight that 7-year-olds bring to dessert in any century you care to name. I find something quietly moving in that detail, actually. 4.5 centuries separate that little girl's face from whatever child you might picture in your own life today, and yet the expression itself, that particular unguarded joy at something sweet arriving at the table, would translate perfectly across every single one of those years, without needing a single word of explanation. Conversation at the table stays light, deliberately so. Father Whitmore mentions a passage from that morning's reading that has stayed with him, offered gently rather than as a formal lesson. Thomas reports, briefly and without alarming detail, that the roof repair for the eastern wing has been agreed with the local craftsman and will begin within the week, weather permitting. Someone mentions the Ashcombe family's likely visit, and there is a small ripple of interest around the table at the thought of guests breaking the winter's quiet, interest that touches, lightly and without anyone saying so directly, on the question of her daughter's eventual future, still years off, still entirely unspoken as anything formal, but present nonetheless in the way these things always were in households like this one. Futures being quietly arranged years before anyone involved was old enough to have an opinion about them. She eats without particular hurry, contributing to the conversation when it turns naturally toward her, asking her son, briefly, how his morning's Latin had gone, receiving in return the slightly put-upon sigh of a 10-year-old who finds grammar considerably less interesting than the stable hand's new hunting dog, a response that draws a small, genuine smile from her, the first entirely unguarded expression to cross her face since the letter arrived 3 hours before. And underneath all of it, quietly, the letter itself sits folded in the pocket of her gown, and I think it is time, now, to tell you what it actually said. It is not, as it happens, about Cromwell, or about any of the larger political tremors moving through the court this particular season. It is smaller than that, and in its own way, more personally weighted. Her husband writes that his business at court, the matter that has kept him away these past 2 months, a question of a disputed inheritance touching a distant cousin's estate, one that required careful, patient negotiation among several interested parties before the King's Own Council, has finally been settled, and settled in their family's favour, though not without cost. He will need to remain a further 2 to 3 weeks to see the necessary documents properly sealed and witnessed, a delay he apologises for with real warmth in his phrasing, the kind of warmth that 14 years of marriage lets you feel clearly, even through the formal cadence of a letter meant to be legible to whichever servant might, in theory, read it aloud on the road if the sealed packet were somehow lost or intercepted. He asks after the children by name. He asks, specifically and with evident concern, after her own health, having heard apparently through some other correspondence entirely that the winter has been a hard one in their part of the country, and he mentions, almost as an afterthought tucked into the letter's final lines, that he has secured, at real expense and no small effort, a length of fine Italian silk he thinks would suit her extremely well, which he intends to bring home himself rather than trust to any messenger, a small, private promise folded into the middle of a letter otherwise concerned with inheritance disputes and travel delays. I want to sit with that for just a moment, because I think it tells you something true about this marriage that the rest of the morning's careful formal machinery does not quite capture on its own. However bound by duty and rank and the practical business of managing land and money this partnership was, and it was bound by all of those things enormously, there was also clearly something warmer running underneath it. A husband 40 miles away and genuinely burdened with difficult business of his own, taking the time to think about silk that would suit his wife. It is a small thing. I think small things like that are often where the real truth of a marriage actually lives, more than in the grander gestures that get written down in official records. The uncertain 3 weeks she has been quietly bracing for stretch out a little longer now, not shorter, and there is a particular kind of tiredness in that, the tiredness of relief and continued waiting arriving in the very same breath, but it is manageable. It has always, so far, been manageable. She refolds the letter, and when her daughter asks a little later whether there has been any news from father, she answers honestly, gently, that he is well, that he is coming home, just not quite yet, and that answer seems to satisfy a 7-year-old's version of patience considerably better than it satisfies her own. Word comes, quietly near the meal's end, that Marjorie's fever has broken, sweat-soaked and exhausted, but clearly unmistakably improving, and there is a small private exhale in that news too, the kind you might not even notice yourself making until it has already happened. Agnes's posset, it seems, did its work this time, and a physician's fee, along with the worry that would have accompanied sending for one, has been quietly avoided. She makes a note, mostly to herself, that Marjorie should have a lighter workload for a few days, yet once she is properly back on her feet, a small kindness that costs the household almost nothing, and that Marjorie will remember, I suspect, considerably longer than her mistress will. I want to tell you a little more about the women who move through this house alongside her, because I think it deepens the picture considerably to understand that she is not managing this morning entirely alone, however much the weight of final decisions rests with her specifically. Joan, her closest attendant, is the daughter of a minor gentleman from a neighbouring county, placed in this household at 16 by an aunt who saw in the arrangement a sensible path toward Joan's own eventual advantageous marriage, since serving closely in a good household of this kind was itself a kind of education and a kind of introduction to the right circles, useful currency for a young woman without a large dowry of her own. She is 24 now, sharp-eyed and quietly funny in a way that only shows itself in private moments, the two of them alone in the bedchamber or the gallery, and there is a real, if carefully bounded, affection between them, built across 8 years of exactly this kind of shared mourning, curtains and cold water and combed hair, and whispered observations about whichever visitor happened to be dining with them the night before. Agnes, the housekeeper, is older, closer to 50, a widow herself who came into this household service after her own husband's death left her without land or income of her own, and who has built in the 15 years since a position of real authority within these walls, answerable in the end to her mistress but trusted, in the daily particulars of the kitchen and still-room and household stores, to exercise judgment entirely her own. There is something quietly remarkable in Agnes's story, actually, a woman who arrived here with almost nothing, and built through competence alone a life of genuine stability and respect within a household not her own, by blood or marriage. Thomas, the steward, comes from a family that has served this particular estate for 2 generations before his own, his father having held the same position under her husband's father, a kind of inherited trust that runs almost as deep as the family bloodline itself, though it carries no title and precious little formal recognition beyond the steady, decent wage and the small cottage on the estate's edge where his own wife and children live. None of these 3 would ever describe their own lives as remarkable, I suspect, if you asked them directly. But I find, the longer I sit with a morning like this one, that the whole quiet architecture of it, the household functioning smoothly enough that a woman can manage an estate, mourn a husband's continued absence, and worry gently over a servant's fever, all within the space of a single morning, depends entirely on people like Joan and Agnes and Thomas, doing work that history rarely bothers to record in any detail at all. The meal winds down slowly, the way these meals always did, no one rising abruptly, conversation thinning gradually into comfortable quiet rather than ending on any particular cue. Her son is released back to a final hour of study before the afternoon proper begins. Her daughter is taken by her nurse for a rest, since even a household this occupied with duty still understood that a 7-year-old's body needed more sleep than an adult's, needed it built into the middle of the day as much as at its edges. And she herself, in the hour that follows, moves into something I think you would recognize immediately, even across 4.5 centuries, as simply the particular texture of an ordinary afternoon settling in after a demanding morning. Not rest exactly, not yet, but a shift in register, the urgent business largely handled, The letter read and answered in her mind, if not yet on paper. Marjorie recovering, the tenants satisfied, the household stores accounted for another day. What remains is smaller, quieter work, the kind that fills the edges of an afternoon rather than driving it. She returns to her needlework for a while, the cushion cover with its vines and small birds, sitting now near the window in the pale grey light of a January early afternoon rather than by candlelight as she had that morning. And there is something different in how the stitches go in now, less a distraction from tension, and more simply a pleasant, unhurried occupation for hands that have spent the whole morning doing considerably more consequential things. The lute player from earlier has moved on to some other task, and a house, for a stretch of perhaps an hour, settles into something close to genuine quiet, the kind of quiet that a house this large and this busy only really achieves in these narrow midday gaps between one set of obligations and the next. I keep thinking, the longer I sit with this particular morning, about how much of what made a day like hers bearable, even good, depended on exactly these small gaps, not grand leisure, not idle hours stretching luxuriously ahead, just small, protected pockets of quiet stitched, if you will forgive the pun, into the seams of an otherwise demanding day. A gallery walk, a half-hour of needlework by a window, 10 minutes of half-listened-to lute music drifting up from somewhere below. These were not incidental to her life. I think, honestly, they were what made the rest of it sustainable. There is a particular quality to the light in this room at this hour that I want you to picture clearly, because I think it captures something about this whole world better than any single fact could. Grey, soft, coming through leaded glass in small diamond-shaped panes that scatter it slightly, breaking one broad beam of daylight into a dozen smaller ones that fall unevenly across the floor's rush matting and the edge of the bed's heavy curtains, still drawn back now from this morning, framing rather than enclosing. Dust moves slowly through that light, visible only in the beam itself, invisible everywhere else in the room. It is the kind of light that asks nothing of you. It simply arrives and sits and waits for the day to decide what to do with it. A tapestry hangs in this room, along the wall opposite the bed, that I have not mentioned yet, and I think it deserves a few minutes of your attention now, in this quieter stretch of the afternoon, because objects like this one carried more weight in a Tudor household than we usually credit them with. It shows a hunting scene, worked in wool and silk thread perhaps 30 years ago, before she was even born. A stag caught mid-leap through a stylized forest, huntsmen and hounds arranged around it in the slightly flattened, decorative perspective typical of tapestry work from this period, more concerned with pattern and narrative clarity than with realistic depth. It came to this house as part of her mother-in-law's own marriage goods, decades before her own arrival, and has hung in this exact spot, she is fairly certain, for the entire span of her own marriage, and likely a good deal longer than that. I find something quietly moving in knowing she sleeps every night beneath a hunt that will never conclude. A stag forever mid-leap, hounds forever mid-pursuit, an image frozen at its most dramatic possible moment and held there, unchanging, while an entire human life, her mother-in-law's, and now her own, unfolds beneath it in real time, full of actual conclusions, actual arrivals, actual endings that the tapestry itself will never share. It is, I think, a strange kind of company to keep, sleeping each night beneath a story that refuses to finish. Beyond the tapestry, if you let your eye travel the rest of this room slowly, there are other objects too, each carrying its own small weight of history. A small carved wooden box on the table near the window, brought from her own childhood home, holding a handful of things that belong entirely to her, rather than to this house or this marriage. A lock of hair from a sister who died young, a small silver coin worn smooth from her own grandmother's handling, a folded piece of ribbon whose original significance she can no longer fully remember, but has never quite been able to discard either. We none of us, I think, fully understand why certain small objects earn this kind of permanent keeping, while others, equally sentimental in the moment, get lost or given away, or simply forgotten. There is something in that worth noticing. The strange, unpredictable logic of what a person decides, across an entire lifetime, is actually worth holding on to. Her wedding ring itself, worn now for 14 years, has worn a faint, permanent groove into the finger beneath it, invisible when the ring is removed, only briefly on the rare occasions she washes without it, present again the moment it slides back on. I think there is something quietly moving in that too, a physical mark left by 14 years of a single continuous choice, present on her body whether she is thinking about her marriage in any given moment or not, the way the deepest habits of a long life eventually stop being decisions at all, and simply become part of the body's own shape. She takes up pen and paper eventually, in the early part of the afternoon, to begin her reply to her husband's letter, though the finished version will not leave this house until tomorrow's post, once she has had time to consider her words properly, rather than rushing them out in the same hour his own letter arrived. Writing, for a woman of her education, was a skill she came to this marriage already possessing, taught alongside reading in her own childhood home, by a tutor her father had engaged for exactly that purpose, unusual perhaps in the depth of it, though not unheard of among families of sufficient means and sufficient ambition for their daughters. The ink is mixed fresh, oak gall and iron and gum arabic, kept as a dry cake and reconstituted with water only when needed, since prepared ink left standing too long would separate and spoil. The pen itself is a goose quill, trimmed carefully with a small knife kept specifically for that purpose, and there is a particular satisfying scratch to a well-cut quill moving across good paper that I think you would find almost meditative if you ever tried it yourself, a sound entirely different from anything a pen makes today, drier, more textured, closer to the sound of a fingernail drawn lightly across fabric than to the smooth glide of modern ink. She writes slowly, choosing her words with real care, because a letter of this kind was never truly private in the way a whispered conversation might be. It could be read aloud by a messenger if circumstances required. It could, in theory, be intercepted, though the likelihood of that happening to a letter as ordinary as this one was genuinely small. But the habit of care ran deep regardless, a habit built across years of understanding that written words, unlike spoken ones, persisted, could be reread, could be shown to others, could outlive the exact private mood in which they were first set down. Word of the roof repair now agreed, of the boundary dispute settled, of Marjorie's recovered health, small steady reassurances that the household continues to function well in his absence, because I think that reassurance mattered to her almost as much as it mattered to him, a way of saying, without needing the words directly, that she was managing, that he could trust this particular part of his life to run smoothly whatever else demanded his attention at court. She mentions their daughter's progress with her sampler, a small detail chosen deliberately because she knows it will make him smile, 40 miles away, reading it in whatever quiet moment he manages to steal from the day's business. And she does not mention, not directly, not in this letter, the particular quality of tiredness that has settled into her these past 2 months, since that tiredness was hers to carry rather than his to worry over from a distance where he could do nothing about it anyway. That, too, was part of the quiet architecture of a marriage like this one. Not every truth needed sharing immediately. Some things could simply be held privately until circumstances allowed them to be set down properly, in person, rather than folded into a letter that would travel 40 miles on a cold road before it ever reached the hands it was meant for. Time itself moves differently through a house like this one than it does through your own day, and I think it is worth pausing on that difference for a moment, because it shapes everything about how a morning like hers actually felt from the inside. There is no clock on the wall the way you might picture one, no steady mechanical ticking marking each minute into its identical neighbour. Time here is marked instead by a small collection of overlapping signals, the bell in the hall's turret rung by hand at set points in the day, roughly rather than precisely, the position of the sun when visible, entirely unhelpful on a grey January day like this one, a small hourglass kept in the chapel to time certain prayers, and beneath all of it, the simple, practised rhythm of habit itself, bodies that have learnt, across years of repetition, roughly how long a task should take without needing a mechanical device to confirm it. I find this genuinely interesting to sit with, actually, because it means her whole relationship to a day's structure was looser than yours or mine, built on rhythm and habit, rather than on the precise, anxious, minute counting that a modern clock tends to encourage in us. She did not know, in any exact sense, that it was currently 1 in the afternoon. She knew instead that dinner had been eaten, that the light outside had reached this particular grey winter quality, that her son would soon be finishing his afternoon lesson, that the day had reached this specific, recognizable stage of itself, and that was enough information to organize everything that needed organizing. Beyond the walls of the rooms we have walked through together this morning, out past the courtyard and the stables and the sleeping winter garden, the estate itself stretches considerably further than the house alone. Fields lying fallow now under January's grip, hedgerows bare and sharp against a grey sky, a scattering of tenant farms whose smoke you can just make out from the upper windows on a still day, thin grey columns rising straight up into an equally grey sky before the wind, when it comes, bends and scatters them. It is not a dramatic landscape, not in this season, not under this light. It is simply patient, the way most of the natural world in an English winter is patient, holding itself in reserve for a spring that feels on a day like today almost impossibly distant, though it will arrive, as it always does, roughly on schedule, indifferent to how long the waiting has felt from the inside of a cold January afternoon. I want to tell you about her own mother for a moment, because I think it helps explain where a competence like hers actually comes from, since none of what we have watched her do this morning arrived in her fully formed. It was taught patiently, across years, the way most real skill in any century actually gets built. Her mother managed a household of similar size and standing, some 60 miles from here, and from the time she was perhaps 8 years old, she was brought along on exactly this kind of morning circuit, watching accounts reviewed, watching disputes settled, watching a woman who looked, to a small child's eyes, entirely certain of herself in every single decision she made. It was only much later, once she herself had taken on this same role in her own marriage, that she came to understand how much of that apparent certainty had likely been performance as much as genuine confidence, a skill her mother had built the same way she herself was building it now, through repetition, through mistakes made privately and corrected quietly, through the simple accumulated weight of having done a difficult thing enough times that it stopped feeling quite so difficult. 6 years ago now, in early spring, her mother died, and there is a particular kind of grief that settles differently once you have taken up the exact work the person you lost once did. A grief threaded through with something close to gratitude, since every account she reviews, every servant's dispute she settles, every quiet, careful calibration of warmth and authority in how she speaks to the people who depend on her, carries some trace of a lesson learned at her mother's side, in rooms not unlike this one, on mornings not unlike this one. I think that is one of the genuinely lovely, quietly sad truths about how skill and love pass between generations. The specific woman is gone. The particular shape of competence she built into her daughter is not, and will not be, not really, for as long as that daughter goes on doing the work in her own turn. There is a version of this same handing down happening right now, this very afternoon, in the small lessons folded into an hour of sampler stitching with her own daughter, in the quiet modelling of how a woman like her carries herself through a difficult morning without ever once appearing rattled. Her daughter will not remember most of the specific details of today, I suspect, the letter, the boundary dispute, Marjorie's fever, but she will remember, I think, in the deep wordless way children remember the emotional texture of their early years far more clearly than the particular events, what it felt like to be raised by a woman who handled hard mornings with this particular kind of steady, unshowy grace. That, more than any single lesson, is probably the truest inheritance passing between them today. Let me tell you a little more about the sheer number of people this single household requires to function, because I think the scale of it is easy to underestimate when we picture one woman managing one house. Beyond the family itself, there is Thomas the steward and his own small staff of clerks, who help him keep the more detailed records. There is Agnes, and beneath her in the kitchen, a head cook, 2 undercooks, and 3 kitchen boys, whose main job most days is hauling water and wood, and doing whatever unglamorous physical labour the cooks themselves have no time for. There is a baker who works almost entirely separately from the main kitchen, given the particular demands of bread on this scale. There is a dairymaid and her assistant, tending perhaps a dozen cows kept on the estate's home farm. There is a laundress, poor recovering Marjorie among them, and 2 assistants, managing linen for a household this size. a task considerably larger than it might sound, since linen needed not just washing, but careful drying, folding and storage against damp and moths alike. There is a gardener, and in the growing season, several additional hands brought on temporarily to manage the kitchen garden's more demanding months. There are grooms and stable hands for the horses, a blacksmith for the estate's ironwork, a small number of general labourers who handle whatever physical maintenance the buildings and grounds require week to week. Above stairs, closer to the family itself, there is Joan, and beneath her a lesser chambermaid who handles the rougher physical work of the bedchambers, the actual scrubbing and rush-changing and heavy lifting that a gentlewoman like Joan would not be expected to do herself. There is the nurse who cares for her daughter, and, until recently, cared for her son as well, before he passed into his tutor's care. There is Father Whitmore, and a clerk who assists him with the chapel's own small library and correspondence. There is a small handful of gentlemen retainers, men of good but lesser family attached to her husband's household, for reasons of both genuine service and useful political alliance. Most of them travelled with him to court, but 2 remaining here, providing a certain necessary presence and protection to a household currently headed, in practice, by its lady rather than its lord. All told, on an ordinary day, this house feeds and houses somewhere close to 40 people, more when her husband's full retinue is present, considerably more still if guests of any real significance arrive. I think that number alone tells you something important about what a household like this actually was, not a family living in a large house. A small, functioning community with its own internal economy, its own social order, its own set of relationships and tensions and loyalties, all of it ultimately resting, in her husband's absence, on the judgment of the woman we have spent this whole morning walking alongside. The great hall itself, where they took their midday meal, deserves a moment more of your attention too, because it is genuinely the heart of this whole operation, in a way none of the smaller rooms quite manage to be. 2 stories high in places, its roof supported by heavy oak beams blackened slightly by decades of hearth smoke, before the household's more recent addition of proper chimneys made that particular staining a thing mostly of the past, rather than the ongoing present. Tall windows along one side, smaller and more defensive feeling on the other, a legacy of an older architectural tradition, where a great house still needed to consider, at least symbolically, the possibility of needing to defend itself. A raised dais at one end, where the family's own table sits, physically elevated above the rest of the hall, in a way that makes the social hierarchy of the household almost embarrassingly literal if you stop to think about it directly. Though, of course, nobody living inside that hierarchy every day would think to describe it in quite those terms. Tapestries line these walls too, larger and more elaborate than the hunting scene in her bedchamber, biblical scenes mostly, chosen partly for their beauty and partly, I suspect, for the quiet moral instruction they offered to anyone who spent enough time looking at them across enough meals over enough years. A great hall like this one was never simply a room for eating. It was a stage, in the truest sense, a space built specifically to display a family's wealth and taste, and standing, to anyone who passed through it, tenant and honoured guest alike, and every single object within it, the tapestries, the salt cellar, the pewter and occasional silver laid out at table, had been chosen with that quiet display in mind. I think it is worth returning, briefly, to something we touched on earlier, the particular texture of clothing across different seasons and different occasions, because the wool gown she wears today, practical and warm and appropriate for an ordinary working January morning, is only one entry in a considerably larger wardrobe suited to a considerably wider range of circumstances. For a formal court occasion, should she ever accompany her husband to such a thing, she would wear something altogether more elaborate, richer fabric, more extensive embroidery, jewellery considerably more visible and more valuable than the simple ring and hidden pendant of an ordinary morning. For deep summer, lighter linen and silk rather than heavy wool, colours chosen to reflect rather than absorb whatever sun an English summer actually offers. For mourning, should the need ever arise, black wool, unadorned, a visual language every single person in this household would instantly understand without a word of explanation required. Clothing, across this whole life, functioned as a kind of continuous, silent communication, announcing season and occasion and rank and mood to anyone with the cultural fluency to read it correctly, which in this world meant essentially everyone. There is a smaller detail I have been holding back until now, one that touches this household more directly than the larger political weather at court, and I think it belongs here, in this quieter stretch of the afternoon, rather than earlier when the pace of the morning was moving faster. Some 4 miles from this house, along the same road the messenger travelled this morning, sits what used to be a priory, a modest religious house that had stood, in one form or another, for close to 3 centuries before it was closed down entirely just 18 months ago, its small community of monks dispersed with pensions of varying generosity, its buildings and lands sold, as so many across the country have been sold these past few years, into private hands. Her husband's family did not acquire that particular property, though a neighbouring family did, and she has ridden past it more than once since the change, watching what used to be a chapel slowly being converted into additional stabling, watching stone that was cut and laid by hands centuries dead being repurposed for entirely practical, entirely secular ends. I do not want to tell you how to feel about that, honestly, because I think reasonable people at the time felt several different ways about it all at once, and reasonable people looking back on it now still do. For some in this county, the closure meant genuine hardship. Monks turned out with no trade beyond religious life to fall back on. Tenants who had rented land from the priory suddenly answering to a new, more commercially minded landlord, with less patience for the old, informal arrangements. For others, it meant opportunity, land and buildings and stone becoming available at prices that let ambitious families expand their own holdings considerably. She herself holds no strong public opinion on the matter, or at least none she would ever voice aloud beyond the walls of this house, though I suspect, privately, watching that old chapel become a stable, she feels something closer to quiet unease than to satisfaction, a sense that the world she was raised to understand is being rearranged, piece by piece, faster than anyone entirely comfortable with the pace. It touches her own household more directly than that, though, because Father Whitmore himself trained as a young man at a different priory, one dissolved 2 years earlier still, and there is a version of his own story quietly known within this household but rarely discussed, where his current position here, secure and reasonably comfortable, exists partly because his previous path simply no longer does. He does not speak of it with bitterness, at least not that she has ever witnessed directly, but there is, I think, a particular kind of steadiness in how carefully he now guards this household's small private chapel, the one space perhaps in this entire changing landscape where the old familiar rhythms of prayer and ritual can continue largely undisturbed, at least for now, at least within these particular walls. I want to go back to the still room for a while, because I only gave it a few minutes of your attention earlier, and I think it deserves considerably more, since it represents, in many ways, the single clearest example of how much practical knowledge a woman in her position was expected to hold in her own head, or at least to oversee closely enough that she could direct it competently, even without doing every task herself. Agnes keeps, in a small locked cupboard within the still room itself, a set of recipes passed down through several generations of housekeepers in this particular household, some written out in a careful, practiced hand on individual sheets of paper, others simply held in memory and taught directly, hand to hand, from one woman to the next. There is a remedy for a persistent cough, honey and vinegar and a little horehound boiled together slowly until reduced. There is a salve for minor burns, common enough given how much of daily life in this house happens near open flame, made from beeswax and a rendered fat, sometimes lard, sometimes goose grease depending on what the kitchen has in ready supply, mixed with crushed comfrey root. There is a remedy for an upset stomach involving chamomile and mint, both grown in the household's own kitchen garden and dried in careful bundles hung from the still room's low beams through the summer months, specifically against the winter's greater need for them. None of this replaces a physician entirely, and for anything genuinely serious, a broken bone, a difficult birth, an illness that does not respond within a few days to the household's own remedies, a physician would be sent for from the nearest town, an expense measured carefully against the severity of the need. But the day-to-day management of minor illness, the coughs and scrapes and upset stomachs that fill any household of 40 people across any ordinary month, rested almost entirely on this accumulated, largely unwritten body of knowledge, tested across generations, adjusted by trial and observation long before anyone in this house would have used a word like science to describe what they were actually doing. She herself knows a good deal of this still-room knowledge, not as deeply as Agnes, who has spent a lifetime accumulating and refining it, but enough to ask the right questions, enough to recognize when a remedy is working as expected and when it is not, and enough, above all, to know when a situation has moved beyond what the still room can reasonably handle, and a physician's more specialized, more expensive attention genuinely becomes necessary. That judgment, knowing where the boundary sits between reasonably manageable and genuinely serious, is itself a skill built the same slow way every other skill in this house was built, through years of watching, asking, and occasionally getting it wrong in ways that taught her, permanently, exactly how not to get it wrong again. The question of her daughter's eventual marriage, touched on earlier with the mention of the Ashcombe family's possible visit, deserves a little more of your attention too, because it is one of those aspects of this world that can look, from a distance, considerably colder than it actually felt from the inside, at least in a household as reasonably careful and affectionate as this one. Marriage among families of this rank was never simply a matter of two young people's private feelings, and I do not want to pretend otherwise. It was, first and fundamentally, an alliance between families, a careful matching of land, wealth, and standing, designed to benefit both sides across generations, rather than simply the two individuals whose names would eventually appear together in a parish register. Negotiations, when they happened in earnest, involved lawyers and detailed discussion of dowries and settlements, sometimes stretching across months or even years before terms both families found acceptable were finally reached. But within that larger, more transactional framework, there was still, in most cases, real attention paid to whether a match seemed likely to produce a genuinely workable, even happy partnership, not out of pure sentiment, but because families understood, practically, that a marriage built entirely on mutual misery tended to produce more problems than it solved. Disputes, neglect, occasionally scandal, none of which served either family's longer-term interests. So when she and her husband have discussed, in the vaguest and most preliminary terms so far, the possibility of a future match between their daughter and the Ashcombe's eldest son, the conversation has included not just questions of land and dowry, but genuine, careful attention to the boy's temperament, what little can be gathered of it second-hand at this early stage, and to whether the two families' broader values and expectations seem likely to align comfortably. Her own marriage, arranged in almost exactly this same fashion 14 years ago, worked out, she would tell you honestly if asked, better than she had any strict right to expect at the time, a partnership that grew into something considerably warmer than the careful, practical negotiation that first produced it. She hopes, quietly and without ever quite saying so aloud even to Joan, that her daughter's eventual marriage might follow a similar path, though she is realistic enough, having watched other families' arrangements unfold less happily over the years, to know that hope is not the same as guarantee, and that a great deal of the eventual outcome will depend on factors entirely outside her own control, however carefully the initial match itself is considered. For now, though, none of this is urgent. Her daughter is 7. Whatever eventual marriage awaits her sits years in the future, and today's attention to the Ashcombe visit is really only the faintest, earliest sketch of a conversation that will not need real substance for a good while yet. It is simply one more thread, quiet and patient, woven into the larger fabric of a household's long-term thinking, alongside the roof repair and the linen stores and the careful management of an estate meant to be handed, someday, considerably improved rather than diminished, into her son's own eventual care. There is one more piece of the morning's responsibilities I have not yet mentioned, quieter than the accounts, less dramatic than the boundary dispute, but woven just as deeply into what was expected of a woman in her position, and that is the household's charitable obligation to the wider community around it. Twice a week, a small gathering forms at the kitchen door. Poorer families from the surrounding parish, widows mostly, along with a few elderly men no longer able to work their own small holdings, come to receive whatever the household can reasonably spare, day-old bread that would otherwise go to waste. a portion of pottage left from the previous day's cooking, occasionally a small allowance of coin for those in particularly difficult circumstances that quarter. This is not simple generosity offered casually. It is understood, throughout this whole society, as a genuine obligation resting on households of wealth, a recognition that land and rank came bundled with responsibility toward those who held neither, and a household that neglected this duty entirely would find its reputation suffering for it just as surely as one that dressed poorly or kept a badly managed kitchen. She does not attend these distributions herself every single time, that task falling most days to Agnes or to a senior servant delegated specifically for the purpose. But she reviews the accounting of it carefully, checking that the obligation is being met consistently and generously enough to reflect well on the household, without being so lavish as to encourage genuine dependency, rather than the more limited, practical assistance it is meant to provide. There is a careful, almost uncomfortable calculation running underneath even this kindness, a balance between genuine compassion and the practical, unsentimental math of a household's own limited resources. And I think it would be dishonest to pretend that balance was always struck perfectly, or that everyone involved found it entirely easy to sit with. Today happens not to be one of the distribution days, but she makes a small note, prompted by nothing more than the general softness of this quieter afternoon hour, to check with Agnes tomorrow that the coming week's allocation has accounted properly for the season's particular hardship, since January and February were reliably the hardest months for the parish's poorer families, stores from the autumn harvest running low, the ground too frozen and too dark for most outdoor labour, wages for those who depended on day work considerably harder to come by than in the busier months of spring and summer. It is a small thing, this mental note, easy to overlook entirely in an account of a morning already full of larger, more dramatic concerns, but I think it belongs here nonetheless, one more thread in the quiet, unglamorous fabric of what actually filled her days, care extended outward, deliberately and consistently, well beyond the walls of her own family's immediate comfort. By the time the afternoon light has shifted from the pale, watery grey of early day into something a little dimmer, still hours from true dusk but already carrying the particular quality January light has of feeling perpetually on the edge of fading, she allows herself a longer stretch of genuinely quiet time than the morning permitted anywhere within it. A small devotional book sits on the table beside her, its cover soft leather, its pages, she knows from long familiarity, slightly uneven at the edges from years of careful handling, a gift from her husband early in their marriage, before either of their children were born, when the shape of their life together was still mostly a promise rather than a fully built thing. She reads slowly, not for any particular purpose beyond the reading itself, a psalm, a short reflection, the kind of quiet devotional literature that filled exactly this kind of gap in a well-run Tudor day, less formal than the morning's chapel prayers, more personal, closer in spirit to simply sitting with your own thoughts in the company of familiar, comforting words. I think there is something worth noticing in how much of her day, when you actually lay it all out end to end the way we have done together this morning, is built from these small recurring moments of stillness threaded between the larger demands, the chapel at dawn, the gallery walk before dinner, the needlework by the window, this quiet half hour now with a well-worn book, none of them individually large, all of them, together, forming a kind of scaffolding that let her carry the weight of everything else, the accounts and the letters and the constant careful performance of competence, without that weight eventually breaking her. This is not so different, honestly, I do not think, from whatever version of this same scaffolding exists in your own life, whatever quiet pockets of stillness you build, deliberately or accidentally, into your own considerably different days. A few minutes with a cup of tea before anyone else in the house wakes, a short walk taken alone. This very habit, actually, this specific choice to let a voice tell you a story at the end of a long day, might be exactly this kind of scaffolding for you, a small protected pocket of stillness that makes everything else more bearable. I like thinking about that, honestly. I like the idea that some things about being a person, needing these small quiet gaps stitched into an otherwise demanding day, have simply not changed very much at all across 4.5 centuries. Her needlework returns to her hands again after the reading, the vine and bird patterns slowly, patiently taking further shape, and I want to let this part of the afternoon simply exist for a while now, without pushing it toward any particular conclusion, because I think that is closer to how it actually felt from the inside, not building toward anything, not waiting for the next demand, just stitches and quiet and grey light through small diamond panes of glass, and a house all around her, continuing its own steady, patient hum of ordinary work. Let me tell you a little more about her son's education, since we touched on it only briefly this morning, because I think it illustrates something important about how differently this household was investing in its two children, a difference she herself, I suspect, felt more complicated about than she would ever have said openly. His tutor, the young clergyman named Master Fenwick, works him through Latin grammar most mornings, the same grinding, repetitive drilling of declensions and conjugations that had shaped the education of every gentleman's son in England for generations before him, considered essential not because most of these boys would ever become scholars in any formal sense, but because fluency in Latin remained the common language of law, of much correspondence, of the church, and of educated conversation more broadly. Alongside it comes arithmetic, practical rather than theoretical, sums and simple accounting exercises, clearly aimed at preparing him for the same kind of estate management his mother handles so competently in his father's absence, and a smattering of history, mostly biblical and classical, delivered less as rigorous study and more as a collection of morally instructive stories meant to shape his character alongside his intellect. He will in a few years likely be sent away from this house entirely, perhaps to be placed in the household of a family of higher standing than his own, a common practice in this period where sons of the gentry and lesser nobility were often fostered out during adolescence to learn the manners, connections, and practical skills of a wider world than their own family home alone could provide. It is a thought that already sits faintly at the edge of her mind on quiet afternoons like this one. The knowledge that her son's childhood in this particular house has a natural, approaching endpoint that her daughter's, oriented instead toward an eventual marriage rather than an eventual fostering out, does not share in quite the same way. I do not think she would describe herself as resentful of the difference in how her children's futures are being shaped, since it was simply the accepted shape of the world she herself was raised within too. But there is, I suspect, a private wistfulness in it nonetheless, a mother who spends considerably more of her own daily hours with her daughter, teaching sampler work and devotional reading and the particular skills a future household mistress will need, and considerably less structured time with her son, whose education has been handed over almost entirely to a tutor's formal instruction. She makes a point, when she can, of asking him about his lessons at meals, the way she did today, of finding small moments to simply talk with him rather than instruct him, small deliberate efforts to keep a closeness that his formal education is already, gently and inevitably, beginning to loosen. There is a broader web of relationships too, beyond this single household's walls, that shapes her days more than any single morning alone might reveal, connections to other families of similar standing scattered across this same county and beyond it, a network held together through visits, correspondence, and the careful ongoing exchange of small gifts and favours that together formed something close to a whole separate economy running alongside the more obvious economy of coin and rent and produce. The Ashcombe family we have already discussed. Beyond them, a family named Pelham, whose eldest daughter she has known since girlhood, and with whom she still corresponds regularly, letters that carry considerably more warmth and considerably less formal caution than the careful correspondence she exchanges with her husband's more distant relations, since a friendship built in childhood, however scattered by marriage and distance since, tends to hold a particular kind of ease that later relationships rarely quite manage to replicate. There is an elderly widow, Lady Featherstone, whose own estate borders theirs to the north, whom she visits perhaps 4 or 5 times a year, and who has become, across the years, something closer to a genuine mentor than a mere neighbour, a woman who managed her own household through considerably harder circumstances than any she herself has yet faced, and whose advice, offered dryly and without excessive sentiment, she has come to value enormously. These relationships mattered practically as much as they mattered personally, a favour extended to a neighbouring family, help during a difficult harvest, a loan of household goods when a neighbour's own stores ran short, a willingness to stand as godparent to a neighbour's child, built a kind of social credit that could be called upon in return when her own household eventually needed it, and a family that neglected these obligations, however wealthy on paper, would find itself considerably more isolated and considerably more vulnerable when genuine hardship, illness, bad harvest, political trouble eventually arrived, as it inevitably did for every family sooner or later. I think there is something worth noticing in how deliberately built this whole web of mutual obligation actually was, not accidental warmth, but careful, ongoing investment, not so different, honestly, from the quiet, deliberate work most of us still put into maintaining our own friendships and family relationships across a busy adult life, even if the specific shape of the obligations involved looks considerably different now than it did then. She thinks, briefly this quiet afternoon, of writing to Lady Featherstone as well as to her husband, a shorter note simply asking after the older woman's health through this hard winter, and decides she will, tomorrow, alongside the longer letter already taking shape for her husband's return post. It is a small thing. It costs her only a few minutes and a little ink and paper. But I think these small things, extended consistently across years and years of ordinary days, were exactly what built and maintained the kind of stability that let a household like this one weather whatever genuinely difficult season eventually arrived. I want to return one more time to the question of food, because I only gave you the shape of a single breakfast and a single midday meal, and I think the fuller picture of how a household like this one actually managed to feed 40 people through an entire English winter deserves a little more of your attention. Everything eaten in this house today, with the exception of a very small number of imported luxuries, spices, certain wines, perhaps a little dried fruit brought in from further afield, was either produced on the estate itself or purchased from markets within a day's travel, and almost all of it was preserved, in one form or another, months before this particular January morning arrived. The mutton on this morning's table came from an animal slaughtered in autumn, its meat salted and stored specifically to see the household through these leaner winter months when fresh meat, beyond the occasional bird taken by the estate's own hunting, becomes considerably harder to come by. The apples that occasionally appear at the family's table, though not today, were picked in September and stored carefully in the cold, dry loft above the buttery, laid out singly rather than piled together so that one spoiling fruit would not spread its rot to its neighbours, a small, patient act of foresight repeated across hundreds of individual pieces of fruit. The household's cheese comes from its own dairy, made through the summer months when the cows produce most abundantly and stored, wrapped and turned regularly, to last through the winter when fresh milk itself becomes considerably scarcer. Grain, wheat for the family's fine white bread and coarser rye and barley for the servants' bread and for brewing, was harvested in August, threshed through the autumn, and stored in quantities carefully calculated by Thomas and by Agnes together to last the entire household through to the following year's harvest, with enough margin built in to survive a poor season without genuine hardship, though not so much surplus that the household was tying up more money in stored grain than good financial sense actually required. I find this whole system genuinely remarkable, honestly. The sheer patient foresight required to feed 40 people for an entire year, using only what a single English estate and its immediate surrounding markets could reasonably provide, with no refrigeration beyond cold stone cellars and careful salting, no ability to simply order more from somewhere else if the calculations proved wrong. Every single meal we have walked through together this morning represents the visible tip of an enormous, largely invisible system of planning, preservation, and careful management stretching back, in some cases, a full year or more before the food itself ever reached the table. It is the kind of quiet, unglamorous competence that rarely gets remembered in the history books, and I think it deserves considerably more credit than it usually receives. The lute player we heard drifting up from below earlier this morning is a household servant named Edmund, kept on partly for his genuine skill, and partly because music, like so much else in this house, served a practical social function as much as a purely artistic one. A household capable of offering real musical entertainment to visiting guests, rather than relying entirely on hired musicians brought in specially for the occasion, was a household demonstrating, quietly, a particular kind of cultivated wealth, the ability to maintain not just necessary staff, but staff whose skills existed purely to enrich the texture of daily and occasional life, rather than simply keep the practical machinery running. She herself plays a little, though not with anything close to Edmund's skill, a small, simple instrument called a virginal kept in a corner of the long gallery, its keys yellowed slightly with age and handling, an instrument her husband had specially commissioned from a craftsman in London as a wedding gift, one of the very few purely decorative luxuries either of them had chosen for purely personal, sentimental reasons, rather than for any practical display of status. She plays it rarely these days, time being what it is, but there is something in the sound of it, when she does sit down at it, simple melodies mostly, that carries her back instantly to the earliest, most uncomplicated months of her marriage, before children, before the full weight of this household's management had settled onto her shoulders, when an afternoon like this one might have been spent at that keyboard for genuine pleasure rather than snatched, rarely, from between more pressing obligations. I think it is worth noticing, honestly, how much of what fills the edges of a life like hers, the virginal in the gallery, the devotional book with its softened, well-handled pages, the small wooden box of childhood keepsakes, exists as a kind of quiet counterweight to the enormous, constant weight of duty that otherwise defines her days. Not escape exactly, she would never have described her own life in terms that dramatic, but a kind of ballast, small pockets of personal meaning tucked carefully into a life otherwise almost entirely organized around obligations to other people, her husband, her children, her household, her wider community. I find myself thinking, the longer I sit with this particular morning, that we all probably need some version of that same ballast, whatever specific shape it takes in our own considerably different lives, some small protected corner of pure personal meaning that has nothing whatsoever to do with what anyone else needs from us. The condition of the roads themselves, muddy and often barely passable through the worst stretches of an English winter, shapes far more of this household's daily rhythm than you might initially expect, and I think it is worth a few final minutes of your attention before we let this particular morning settle fully into its quieter close. That messenger who arrived earlier today made reasonably good time, the roads having frozen hard rather than turned to the deep, sucking mud that a thaw would bring. Frozen ground being, paradoxically, considerably easier and faster to travel than the wet, churned mess that came with milder winter weather. She has learned, across years of managing correspondence and supplies dependent on exactly this unpredictable travel, to build in generous margins for delay, orders placed with London merchants weeks before the goods are actually needed, letters sent with reasonable but never absolute confidence about when a reply might arrive. It is a kind of patience that I think has simply vanished almost entirely from how most of us live now, waiting genuinely uncertain weeks for a response to something we asked, adjusting plans around weather and road conditions that a modern life mostly lets us ignore entirely. I find myself thinking, honestly, about how differently urgency itself must have felt inside a life shaped by these particular limits. Nothing could truly be resolved instantly, whatever the actual emotional weight of the matter at hand, a crisis at court, a dispute with a neighbouring family, even genuinely happy news, a birth, a successful negotiation, all of it travelled at the speed of a horse and the condition of a road, and everyone involved understood and accepted that reality as simply the basic shape of how information and decision moved through the world. There is something almost peaceful in that thought, when I sit with it long enough, a reminder that entire functioning societies, entire full and complicated human lives unfolded perfectly well within limits that would feel, to you and me, almost unbearably slow. The weather itself, beyond just the roads, shapes so much of what we have walked through together this morning that I want to name it directly, one final time, before we let this particular day rest. Every single decision, the firewood carefully counted against the remaining stretch of winter, the salted stores calculated to last until spring's first fresh provisions, the very clothes chosen each morning, exists in constant negotiation with a climate that offered no guarantees and precious little warning. A household like this one did not simply endure winter, It planned for it months in advance, with a seriousness and a thoroughness that I think our own considerably more insulated modern lives rarely require of us anymore. And there is something, I think, quietly impressive in that constant patient vigilance, however much I am also, honestly, glad not to have to practice it myself. I want to slow down here for a while now, because I think we have covered enough of the practical architecture of her morning, the accounts and the letters and the dressing and the meals, that we can afford, for these final stretches, to simply sit inside the feeling of this particular day, rather than continuing to add new information to it. Picture her, once more, in that small room off the hall where she reviewed the accounts with Thomas so many hours ago now, except the light through its single narrow window has shifted considerably since then, thinner now, greyer, the particular quality of a January afternoon that has stopped being properly bright without yet becoming properly dim. She is not there right now, that room having served its morning purpose and gone quiet again until tomorrow's accounts require it. But I want you to hold the image of it anyway, empty now, the ledger closed and returned to its chest, the single candle that burned there this morning long since extinguished, waiting, patient and undisturbed, for the same routine to begin again with tomorrow's dawn. That is the thing about a day like this one, I think, the thing that makes it feel, the longer you sit with it, less like a single dramatic story and more like one careful repetition within an enormous ongoing pattern. Tomorrow, the curtains will open again, perhaps to a colder morning still, perhaps to the first faint hint of a thaw. Joan will light the fire again, coax it from ember to proper flame with the same practiced hands. The chapel candle will be lit before she arrives, exactly as it was today. Thomas will bring his ledger, and there will be some new small crisis, a leak somewhere else, a dispute among different servants, a different letter carrying different news, layered over the same steady, patient rhythm we have walked through together this whole morning. I find something genuinely comforting in that repetition, actually, rather than finding it monotonous, and I wonder if you do too. There is a particular kind of peace available in a life built around rhythms this steady, this practiced, this thoroughly known in advance. She does not wake each morning wondering, with any real anxiety, what the day will ask of her, because she already knows, in its broad shape if not its every particular, exactly what the day will ask. The curtains, the cold water, the chapel, the dressing, the accounts, the meal, the small accumulating decisions that keep 40 people fed and housed and reasonably content through another ordinary winter day. It is demanding, certainly. It is not, in any simple sense, easy, but it is knowable, and I think there is a genuine comfort in knowable structured demand that our own considerably more unpredictable modern lives sometimes lack. Let your own body settle a little further into wherever you are lying right now, if it has not already settled as far as it can go. There is nothing more this particular morning needs from you, no further detail to track, no further thread to hold on to. You have walked the whole shape of it now, dawn to midday and a little beyond, cold room to warm hall, private worry to quiet, patient competence. Come back with me, one final time, to that bedchamber where we began, because I think there is something worth noticing in it now that we could not fully appreciate at 5 o'clock this morning, when the cold and the dark made it feel, understandably, like nothing more than an obstacle to be gotten through as quickly as possible. The bed sits there now, curtains drawn back fully rather than closed, its heavy wool hangings catching what little grey afternoon light finds its way through the window, the feather mattress beneath them still holding, faintly, the shape 2 bodies left in it hours ago, a shape that will be smoothed away entirely by the time she returns to it tonight. The linens changed if it happens to be the particular day of the week set aside for exactly that task, fresh rushes strewn if the old ones have grown tired and flattened underfoot. The small fire that took so long to properly catch this morning burns steadily now, tended at intervals throughout the day by whoever happens to pass near enough to notice it needs feeding, filling the room with a warmth entirely different from the close, trapped warmth of the curtained bed at dawn, an open ambient warmth that makes the whole room feel, by this hour, considerably more like a place someone might genuinely want to linger in rather than simply escape from as quickly as possible. Above it all, the tapestry watches still, that stag forever mid-leap, those hounds forever mid-pursuit, unbothered by the hours that have passed beneath it, unbothered by the letter read and half answered, the fever broken, the boundary dispute settled, the whole small, complete arc of a single morning's worth of human worry and competence and quiet, accumulated care. I keep coming back to that tapestry, and I think it is because there is something genuinely soothing in its permanence, a fixed point in a room where everything else, the light, the temperature, the occupant's own mood and posture and pressing concerns, shifts constantly across the hours. Her wedding ring, worn now for 14 years, catches a little of the firelight as her hand rests, for a moment, against the edge of the bed frame, and I want you to picture that small, warm gleam clearly, gold against skin against dark wood, because I think it is exactly the kind of small, ordinary, unremarkable image that a whole life is actually built from, far more than the larger dramatic moments we tend to remember and retell. Not the boundary dispute, not even the letter, however much weight it carried this particular morning. Just a hand, resting against familiar wood, in a room grown warm and quiet by the middle of an ordinary winter afternoon. Somewhere below, the kitchen has settled into its own quieter afternoon rhythm too, the frantic early morning energy of bread and roasted fowl long since given way to something calmer, preparations already beginning, unhurried, for the evening meal still hours away, a pot of something simmering low and slow over a banked fire, one of the kitchen boys sweeping the stone floor with the same patient, repetitive motion Agnes taught him months ago, sweeping not because the floor is especially dirty, but because a clean kitchen, checked and swept at regular intervals throughout the day, was simply part of how a well-run household maintained itself, one small habitual task among hundreds of others, each one unremarkable alone, each one essential in its accumulated whole. Joan sits nearby her mistress in the quiet of this afternoon, her own hands occupied with a small piece of mending, a torn seam in one of the household's linen items that needs attention before it can go back into general use, and there is a comfortable, wordless quality to their shared silence that I think tells you something true about the particular kind of closeness that 8 years of exactly this daily proximity can build between two people. Not friendship exactly, not in the fully equal sense you or I might use that word, but something real nonetheless, a genuine warmth built from thousands of small, shared, unremarkable hours just like this one. I want you to hold this image for a while, this quiet room, this low fire, these two women occupied with their separate small tasks in comfortable, companionable silence, because I think it captures something essential about what a life like hers actually was, underneath all the larger, more dramatic threads we have followed this morning. Not constant crisis, not endless, exhausting demand, mostly actually exactly this, quiet, ordinary, small tasks completed patiently, one after another, in the company of people who had become, across years of shared proximity, something close to family, however differently that word might have applied across the particular lines of rank and service that shaped this whole household. The gardens outside, visible faintly through the window if you leaned to look, sit in exactly the same bare, patient winter stillness they held this morning, hedges clipped into shapes that will not properly reveal themselves again until spring, the kitchen garden's soil dark and resting, holding, invisibly, the promise of everything that will eventually grow there again once the season finally turns. Nothing about that garden has changed since dawn, and yet everything about how she sees it has, I think, shifted subtly across the hours of this single full morning, seen now through the settled, accomplished quiet of a day's most demanding work already behind her, rather than through the tired, bracing alertness of 5 o'clock, when the whole day still lay ahead, unknown, waiting to be met one careful decision at a time. There is a particular kind of quiet satisfaction, I think, in a day like this one, once it has reached this settled, accomplished stretch of afternoon, and I want to name it carefully, because it is not the same as happiness exactly, and it is not the same as relief either, though it carries something of both inside it. It is the satisfaction of a person who woke into cold and darkness with a full, uncertain day ahead of her, and who has, through nothing more dramatic than steady, careful attention applied consistently across several hours, brought that day to a place of genuine order. The accounts are reviewed and understood, the boundary dispute is settled in a way both parties can live with, the roof will be repaired within the week, Marjorie is recovering rather than worsening. Her husband is delayed but safe and coming home eventually, with silk chosen specifically with her in mind. Her children are fed, taught, and cared for. The household's poor will be provided for according to the same steady rhythm they always have been. None of it is finished exactly in any permanent sense, because a household like this one is never finished, only ever maintained, one day folding into the next in an unbroken chain that will continue long after this particular January morning has faded into simple, unremarkable memory. But it is for today in order, and I think that particular feeling, the settled satisfaction of a day's worth of scattered demands successfully gathered and managed, is one of the most universally recognizable feelings a human being can have, whatever century you happen to be having it in. I keep thinking, the longer we have sat together inside this one particular morning, about how much of what actually constitutes a full, meaningful human life is built from exactly this kind of unremarkable accumulated competence, rather than from the rare, dramatic moments that tend to dominate the stories we tell about the past. Nobody will ever write a ballad about the boundary dispute she settled today, or the posset that broke Marjorie's fever, or the careful, patient calculation that kept a household of 40 people fed through an entire uncertain winter. History, as it gets written down and remembered, tends to favour the dramatic, the exceptional, the moments that break sharply from ordinary rhythm, rather than the ordinary rhythm itself. But I think the ordinary rhythm was always, in the truest sense, the actual substance of most people's lives, then just as clearly as it is now, and there is something I find genuinely worth honouring in taking the time, as we have done together this morning, to sit inside that rhythm carefully and completely, rather than rushing past it toward whatever more dramatic moment might eventually follow. She does not know this quiet afternoon that she will be remembered by anyone beyond her own immediate family and household, that her name will not appear in any history book, that this particular morning, so full and so carefully lived, will simply dissolve into the enormous, largely unrecorded ocean of all the other ordinary mornings that made up the actual texture of life in this period, far more numerous and far more representative than any single dramatic event ever could be. I do not think that would trouble her especially if she considered it directly. She was not living this day for the sake of being remembered. She was living it the way most of us live most of our days, simply because it needed living, one careful, attentive hour at a time. The rest of this particular day, though it sits beyond the edges of what we set out this morning to walk through together, will unfold in ways you could probably sketch out yourself now, having spent this many hours inside the rhythm of this particular household. There will be a further stretch of quiet afternoon work, more correspondence perhaps, a final check of the day's smaller domestic matters with Agnes before evening properly arrives. Her children will be brought to her again before their own bedtime, her daughter for a last few minutes of quiet conversation, and perhaps a story, her son released finally from Master Fenwick's afternoon lesson to spend a rare unstructured hour before supper doing whatever a boy of 10 actually wants to do with unstructured time, which today, I suspect, involves that stable hand's new hunting dog rather than anything more formally instructive. There will be a supper, smaller and less formal than today's midday meal, and afterward, as the light fails entirely and the candles are lit throughout the house, a slower, quieter kind of evening settling over everything, the household's more demanding work largely finished for another day, only the essential overnight tasks, the banking of fires, the securing of doors, the final check of the stock and stores, remaining to be completed before the whole house, servant and family alike, finally gives itself over to rest. And eventually, hours from now, well after we have left her for tonight, she will find her own way back to that same curtained bed where this whole morning began, Joan drawing the heavy hangings closed again around her, sealing in whatever warmth the day's fire has managed to build, the tapestry's frozen hunt watching over her sleep, just as it has watched over every other night of this particular decade of her life. Tomorrow, the whole pattern will begin again, curtains opened instead of closed, cold instead of warmth, a new day's uncertain shape waiting to be met and managed and, by its own particular midday, brought carefully into order once more. I think there is something quietly beautiful in that repetition. The way this single day we have spent together this morning is really only one instance, one particular telling of a pattern that repeated itself, with small variations across every single day of her adult life, and will continue repeating in its broad shape if not its every specific detail for as many years still ahead of her as circumstance allows. That is, I think, simply what a life actually is, underneath whatever dramatic moments occasionally punctuate it. A pattern, repeated patiently, day after day, each repetition slightly different from the last, and each one, in its own quiet way, complete. Honestly, I wonder whether some version of that same pattern shapes your own life too, whatever considerably different form it takes, in whatever considerably different century and circumstance you happen to be living through right now. Not the curtained bed, not the ledger and the keys and the careful daily negotiation with an unheated stone house in January, but the underlying shape of it, perhaps, waking into uncertainty, meeting a series of demands, some large, some small, with whatever steady competence you have built across your own years of practice, finding, somewhere in the middle of an ordinary day, small pockets of genuine stillness that make the rest of it bearable, bringing things by evening into whatever order you can manage, imperfect but sufficient, before beginning the whole pattern again tomorrow. There is something quietly comforting in that thought, the idea that whatever specific shape your own daily pattern takes, there is a kind of deep ongoing kinship between your life and hers, between this cold January morning in 1540 and whatever particular evening you happen to be lying in right now, listening to this story instead of living one of your own. The details change enormously across 4.5 centuries. Curtained beds become whatever bed you are actually lying in right now. Ledgers and keys become whatever considerably different responsibilities fill your own days, but the underlying rhythm, waking, working, gathering small moments of stillness, bringing the day into whatever order you can manage, resting, and beginning again, that rhythm, I think, has held remarkably steady across an enormous stretch of human time, holding you and her both inside something considerably larger and older than either one of your individual lives. Let that thought settle over you now, if it wants to settle, the way the evening settled over her particular house all those centuries ago. You do not need to hold on to any more of the day's specific details, the boundary dispute, the letter, the careful accounting of firewood and linen and stored grain. You have already carried all of that, patiently, this whole morning long, the way she carried it herself. Let it go now. Let your own body sink a little further into whatever softness is currently holding it. Let your own breathing slow, the way a house slows, gradually, unhurriedly, as evening settles fully into night. Picture with me, one final time, the way this particular house sounds and smells and feels as a day like this one finally fully surrenders itself to evening, because I think there is real comfort waiting in these small, specific sensory details, more comfort, honestly, than in any further explanation I could offer you about accounts or duties or the particular political pressures of the year 1540. The smell of wood smoke thickens throughout the house as more fires are built up against the coming cold of night, mixing with the lingering scent of the evening supper still hanging faintly in the air near the kitchen and the hall, roasted meat and baked bread and something faintly herbal underneath it all, rosemary perhaps, or sage, whatever Agnes reached for without quite thinking this particular evening. Candlelight replaces daylight gradually across every room, warmer and more golden than the flat grey of a winter afternoon, throwing long soft shadows across walls and tapestries and the careful worn wood of furniture handled daily by generations of hands before her own. Sound changes too, the brisk, purposeful footsteps and raised, practical voices of the working day gradually giving way to something quieter, softer, the low murmur of conversation rather than instruction, the occasional creak of the great house settling into itself as the temperature drops outside its thick stone walls, a sound she has learned, across 14 years in this particular house, to find comforting rather than alarming, the simple, familiar voice of an old building doing exactly what old buildings have always done as day gives way to night. Somewhere, a door is checked and secured for the night, a nightly ritual overseen by one of the senior manservants, the whole house gradually locking itself into its own protected stillness the way a person might pull a blanket more snugly around their own shoulders, a last check of the kitchen fire, banked properly to hold its heat through the night without burning dangerously unattended. A last look from Agnes at the still room's careful stores, and from Thomas at the accounts already reviewed once this morning and now, for the day's purposes, finally fully closed. And somewhere above it all, in that same bedchamber where we began this whole long full morning together, the heavy curtains will in time be drawn closed once more, sealing in warmth against a winter night, sealing in, too, whatever quiet satisfaction a day this thoroughly, this competently lived can offer a person by its own natural end. I want you to hold that image now, gently, as we bring our own time together tonight to its own close. Heavy curtains drawn shut, a small fire banked and glowing, a whole house and a whole life settling patiently into rest. I have wondered more than once while putting this particular morning together for you, how we actually come to know any of these details at all. 4.5 centuries after a woman very much like her lived through a morning very much like this one, and I think that question is worth sitting with briefly before we let this story rest entirely. Household accounts survive, in fragments, and sometimes in remarkably complete form, in county archives and family collections across England. Careful records of exactly the kind Thomas kept this morning. Wages paid, goods purchased, repairs commissioned, the whole practical skeleton of daily household management preserved, often by pure accident of survival, long after the people who created them have been forgotten by everyone but the most patient historians. Letters survive too, personal correspondence between husbands and wives, between friends, between mothers and daughters, offering glimpses, sometimes surprisingly intimate ones, into exactly the kind of private warmth and private worry that filled a letter like the one that arrived at this house today. Wills survive, inventories of household goods survive, occasionally even personal devotional books survive, their margins sometimes carrying small handwritten notes that let us hear, faintly but genuinely, an individual human voice reaching across an otherwise silent gap of centuries. No single woman's morning, exactly as I have described it to you tonight, survives in any one complete record. What we have instead is something closer to a mosaic, hundreds of individual fragments, an account book here, a letter there, an inventory listing a tapestry or a virginal or a particular gown, a court record noting a boundary dispute settled between neighbouring landowners, a parish record noting the closure of a nearby priory, all of it pieced together carefully by historians across generations of patient, careful work, until a picture emerges, not of any single specific woman, but of the shape a life like hers, broadly and honestly, actually took. That is the quiet, patient labour underneath every story like the one I have told you tonight, and I think it deserves, itself, a small measure of the same respect we have extended, this whole evening, to the patient, unglamorous competence of the woman at its centre. I find something moving in that too, honestly, the thought that her particular story, invented for you tonight but built entirely from genuine historical texture, stands in for hundreds of thousands of actual women who lived lives shaped very much like this one, whose individual names have mostly been lost, but whose collective pattern of quiet, careful, competent daily labour has not been lost at all, preserved instead in exactly the kind of patient, accumulated record that lets us sit here together tonight, all these centuries later, and genuinely understand what an ordinary Tuesday or an ordinary cold morning in January actually felt like for a woman very much like her. Let us return, one final time, to the very beginning of what we have shared together tonight, because I think there is a particular kind of comfort in coming full circle before we finally let go entirely. It was not yet 5 o'clock in the morning when we first met her, curtains still closed around a warm, dark bed, the whole cold shape of an uncertain day still waiting ahead of her, unmet, unmanaged, nothing yet decided or settled or brought into order. I asked you back then to imagine the particular weight of that moment, the half-second between complete warmth and the first bracing rush of a January morning's cold air, arriving all at once as Joan drew the near curtain open. We have walked, together, the entire distance from that moment to this one, hours and hours of a single, full, carefully lived morning, washing and prayer, and the long, patient work of dressing, a modest breakfast and a steward's careful accounts, a daughter's sampler, and a son's Latin grammar, a letter carried 40 miles on a frozen road and answered, eventually, with the same steady, careful hand that managed everything else this house required of her today. We have met Joan and Agnes and Thomas, walked through kitchens and still rooms and a long gallery lit by pale winter light, sat with her through a formal midday meal beneath the hall's watching tapestries, and settled, finally, into the quieter, slower rhythm of an afternoon earned through hours of careful, competent labour. And now here we are, at the end of it, the same curtains that opened this whole story finally closing again, the same warmth that was so abruptly interrupted at dawn finally, gradually, being restored. I think there is something genuinely satisfying in that shape, that circle, the way a single day, however full and demanding in its middle stretches, always eventually finds its way back to rest, the way every single one of the countless mornings she lived through across her whole life followed this same essential arc, cold to warm, uncertainty to order, waking to rest, over and over and over again, each repetition slightly different in its particulars, each one, in its own quiet way, complete. I want to name one more quiet comparison before we let this story rest entirely, because I think it might be the truest thing we have said all night. Her competence, her steadiness, her careful management of an entire household through an uncertain year. None of it came from some rare, exceptional gift unavailable to ordinary people. It came from practice, from repetition, from the simple, patient accumulation of thousands of ordinary days, handled with whatever attention she had available on any given morning, some days more than others, some mornings harder than this one, some considerably easier. That is, I think, the quiet, comforting truth underneath everything we have walked through together tonight. Competence like hers is built, not born, assembled slowly out of exactly the kind of unremarkable, repeated effort that fills your own days too, whatever specific shape that effort happens to take. There is, too, the particular sound of a house exhaling at the end of a demanding day, the way tension that has held a whole building taut since before dawn seems to loosen gradually across the evening hours, voices dropping lower, footsteps slowing, even the fires themselves seeming to settle into a calmer, steadier burn once the day's most urgent business has finally passed. There is nothing measurable about this, nothing you could point to directly and prove, and yet I suspect anyone who has spent real time inside a working household, then or now, would recognize exactly the shift I am describing, the particular way a full day's accumulated effort finally, gradually, releases itself into evening. A softness settles over this particular hour that I do not think exists at any other point across the whole span of her day, not the alert, bracing readiness of 5 in the morning, not the busy, purposeful focus of the accounts or the meal or the tenant's dispute, not even the pleasant, occupied stillness of the afternoon's needlework. This is something quieter still, the particular softness of a day genuinely finished rather than merely paused, and I want you to notice, if you can, whether some version of that same softness is beginning to settle over you too, right now, in this quiet room, wherever you happen to be listening from tonight. She feels it too, I think, somewhere in her own shoulders and the base of her own neck, a tension she was not fully conscious of carrying until it finally begins, slowly to ease. It is not that the day's concerns have vanished entirely. Her husband is still 40 miles away. The political weather at court remains genuinely uncertain. Marjorie's fever, while broken, will need another day or two of careful watching before anyone can call her fully recovered, but the acute, active management of all of it has passed for today, handed over now to the quieter, more passive work of simply resting and waiting and trusting that tomorrow's version of herself will meet whatever tomorrow actually brings with the same steady competence today's version managed to find. Even the light in the room has changed one final time since we last paused to notice it, the pale grey of afternoon giving way now to the warmer, dimmer gold of candlelight alone, no daylight left at all to compete with it, and there is something in that particular light, I think, that asks nothing further of anyone in this house, only that they let it hold them gently until sleep finally, properly arrives. There is one final small scene I want to leave with you before we let the whole day close, something I think captures, better than any of the larger explanations we have offered tonight, the particular quality of quiet contentment available even inside a life this demanding and this thoroughly structured by duty. It happens in the late afternoon, after the letter is written and set aside for tomorrow's post, after the needlework has been folded away and the devotional book returned to its place on the table, in that narrow window of time between the day's obligations and the evening's own beginning. Her daughter finds her again, unbidden, climbing up onto the bench beside her, simply for the pleasure of being near her mother, rather than for any lesson or instruction, and for a few minutes the two of them simply sit together in comfortable silence, her daughter's small head resting against her arm, the fire crackling low nearby, the whole enormous, complicated architecture of household and duty and rank and religious uncertainty and political caution simply set aside for these few minutes in favour of nothing more complicated than a mother and daughter sitting quietly together at the end of a long, full day. I think this is worth holding on to, more than almost anything else we have discussed tonight, because it reminds us that underneath all of the careful historical detail, the accounts and the dressing rituals and the quiet religious tension of a particular difficult year, there was still, always, this simple, unremarkable tenderness, a mother and a daughter sitting together, needing nothing from each other beyond exactly this closeness. It is the kind of moment that leaves no trace in any account book or any surviving letter, the kind of moment history simply cannot preserve directly, and yet I suspect it was every bit as real, every bit as central to what actually made her life feel worth living as any of the larger, better documented events we have walked through together this morning. She will carry that same warmth with her, I think, into whatever the evening still holds, into supper and the final small tasks of the day, and, eventually, into the same curtained bed where this whole story began. And I want you to carry a version of that same warmth with you too, into whatever remains of your own night, whatever quiet, unremarkable tenderness fills the edges of your own days, unnoticed most of the time, and yet, I suspect, every bit as essential to a genuinely good life as any of the larger, more visible accomplishments we tend to measure ourselves against. I want to leave you now with a slower, gentler rhythm than the one we started with this morning, because I think that is exactly what this particular hour of your own night is asking for. Whatever specific circumstances brought you here tonight, whatever your own day carried before you found your way into this particular story. Picture that curtain closing one final time, heavy wool falling back into place, sealing warmth in, sealing the cold and the demands and the careful constant vigilance of an entire ordinary day out, at least for these next several hours. Picture the small fire, banked low, glowing rather than blazing, enough warmth to hold through the night without needing further tending until dawn calls the whole pattern back into motion again. Picture Joan settling onto her own low trundle bed a few feet away, the particular, familiar comfort of not being entirely alone even in the deepest, quietest part of the night. Picture the tapestry above them both, that stag forever caught mid-leap, that hunt that will never conclude, watching over another night's rest the way it has watched over so many nights before this one, and will watch over so many more nights still to come. I think, honestly, there is something quietly reassuring in a permanence like that, a hunt that never finishes, a pattern that simply continues, patient and unbroken, regardless of whatever particular worry or letter or fever or boundary dispute happen to fill any single day underneath it. Your own night carries its own version of that same permanence, I suspect, whatever specific shape it takes for you, a room that has held you through countless other nights before this one, a rhythm of rest and waking that has carried you, patiently, through however many years of your own life so far, and will, in all likelihood, continue carrying you through however many more nights still lie ahead. Let yourself rest inside that permanence now, the way she is resting inside hers. You do not need to hold on to anything more from tonight's story. The accounts are closed, the letter is answered, the boundary dispute is settled, and Marjorie is recovering, and a husband is coming home, eventually, with Silk chosen carefully with someone he loves in mind. Everything that needed managing today has been managed, patiently and competently, by a woman who woke into cold uncertainty and brought, through nothing more dramatic than steady attention applied consistently across many careful hours, an entire complicated household into quiet, settled order. You can do the same with your own day now. Whatever it carried, however demanding or uncertain or simply long it might have been, let it settle. Let it close, the way those heavy curtains have closed, one final time, around a warm, quiet room and a small, steady fire, and the patient, unhurried dark of a winter night finally, fully arrived. Before we let this particular morning rest entirely, I want to take a little more time with something we have touched on only briefly so far, the actual shape of where a household like hers sat within the wider structure of English society in 1540, because I think it helps make sense of so many of the small decisions and quiet pressures we have walked through together this morning. Her husband holds the title of Baron, a rank that places this family solidly within the peerage, the formal ranks of English nobility, though considerably below the greater titles of Earl, Marquess and Duke that sat closer to the king himself. Above even those, of course, sat the king alone, a single figure whose favour or displeasure could reshape the fortunes of any family beneath him, however grand their own title. Below the peerage sat the much larger and more varied ranks of the gentry, knights and esquires and simple gentlemen, families of real wealth and local standing, but without the formal titles and parliamentary rights that marked the peerage as genuinely distinct. And below the gentry sat the great mass of English society, yeomen farmers, craftsmen, labourers, the overwhelming majority of the population, whose lives, however much this whole morning's story has focused on a household of considerable privilege, actually made up the far more common, far more numerous texture of daily life in this period. I think it is worth being honest about where this places the woman we have spent this whole morning with. She is genuinely privileged, genuinely wealthy by any reasonable historical standard, commanding a household of some 40 people and an estate substantial enough to require the kind of careful ongoing management we have walked through together in such detail. But she is not, within her own social world, among the very highest ranks either. There were households above hers, considerably grander, considerably more exposed to the direct and immediate currents of royal politics, and there were households below hers, considerably more modest, where a woman might manage a much smaller staff and a much simpler set of daily obligations, though I suspect the underlying rhythm of competence and care would have looked remarkably similar in its basic shape, however different the specific scale. This matters, I think, because it means her particular morning, demanding and privileged as it clearly was, actually represents something closer to a genuinely broad, representative slice of English gentry and lesser nobility life in this period, rather than the rarefied, exceptional existence of the very highest court circles. Hundreds, probably thousands of households across England in 1540 would have followed a broadly similar pattern: curtains and cold and prayer and dressing and accounts and children and letters, each one with its own particular details, but all of them built from essentially the same underlying architecture of duty and competence and quiet, patient care. Her story, in that sense, is not really about one remarkable woman at all. It is about an entire, largely unrecorded class of women whose daily labour held together an enormous portion of English society, one carefully managed household at a time. I want to say a little more, too, about the physical house itself, the actual stone and timber and glass that shaped every single hour we have spent together this morning, because I do not think I have given you quite enough of its architecture to picture it fully. This is not a house built all at once, in a single unified style, but one that has grown across roughly a century and a half, an older medieval core at its centre, thick-walled and defensively minded, dating back to a time when a house of this rank genuinely needed to consider its own physical security in a way that had become, by 1540, considerably less pressing a concern. Around and beyond that older core, her husband's grandfather and father each added their own extensions, the long gallery among the more recent of these additions, built specifically to showcase the family's growing wealth and taste, with the kind of generous, light-filled space that an older, more defensive medieval hall simply could not offer. The result is a house that reads, if you know how to look, almost like a physical timeline of the family's own fortunes. Each generation's additions a little more focused on comfort and display, a little less focused on pure defensibility, tracking the same broader shift happening across English domestic architecture throughout this entire century. The windows themselves tell part of this story too. The oldest parts of the house still carry narrow, deep-set windows, more like arrow slits softened slightly for practical light than the generous glazed openings we associate with later Tudor building. The newer sections, including the long gallery and several of the family's own private chambers, carry considerably larger windows, their many small diamond panes held together with strips of lead, a genuinely expensive architectural feature in this period, glass itself remaining costly enough that window size functioned as its own quiet, unmistakable marker of wealth, much the way a candle's material, tallow or beeswax, marked a household's means in a smaller, more everyday way. Its roof, source of this week's particular repair concern, is steep-pitched and covered in local stone tile, rather than the thatch that would have covered a more modest farmhouse in the same county, itself another quiet marker of the resources this family could bring to bear on even its most basic structural maintenance. Chimneys rise from several points across the roofline, a relatively recent architectural development in England's broader domestic building history, allowing fires to be built safely in individual rooms throughout the house, rather than relying, as older houses often still did, on a single central hearth in the Great Hall, with smoke finding its own way out through vents in the roof. That single innovation, chimneys distributed throughout a house, rather than concentrated in one central hall, changed domestic life in England more thoroughly than almost any other architectural development of this whole century, allowing exactly the kind of private, individually heated chambers, her own bedchamber among them, that made so much of this morning's particular texture of comfort and privacy possible in the first place. I want to return briefly to the question of textiles and dye, because I only touched on it lightly this morning when describing her gown, and I think the fuller picture deserves a few more minutes of your attention, given how much of this entire world, its wealth, its display, its careful hierarchies of rank, was quite literally woven into the cloth people wore. The deep green wool of her gown today came, originally from sheep raised on this very estate, part of a substantial flock that provided not just meat, but the raw material for a considerable portion of the household's own textile needs, sheared each spring, the wool sorted by quality, the finest reserved for the family's own clothing, and the coarser grades sent for sale or used in the servants' own garments and the household's blankets and hangings. That raw wool was spun, in this case not within the household itself, but by a local spinner working under contract, into thread fine and even enough for quality cloth, then woven by a weaver in the nearest market town, and finally dyed, a process requiring genuine skill and genuinely expensive materials, since a deep, even green like the one she wears required a careful combination of dyes, likely woad for the blue undertone, and a yellow derived from local plants, applied in careful sequence and proportion by a dyer whose particular skill at achieving consistent, fade-resistant colour was worth considerably more to a household like this one than a less careful craftsman's cheaper work. Every single stage of that process, the raising of the sheep, the shearing, the spinning, the weaving, the dyeing, and finally the cutting and sewing into the actual garment she wears, involved different specialized workers, different transactions, different careful judgments about quality and cost that ultimately fell, in most cases, to her own oversight and approval. I think this is worth sitting with for a moment, because it means that the gown we described her putting on so many hours ago this morning was never simply an object she selected from some equivalent of a wardrobe. It was the visible endpoint of an entire small economy she had helped direct and manage. One more example, alongside the accounts and the stores and the careful provisioning of food across an entire winter, of the sheer breadth of practical knowledge and oversight a woman in her position was expected to hold. The very colour she chose to wear today, that deep, saturated green, was itself a small daily decision layered with meaning, appropriate for an ordinary working morning, rather than the brighter, more elaborate colours reserved for formal occasions, practical and warm-toned for the season, flattering without being showy, a decision made, like so many decisions in this house, with an instinctive, well-practiced understanding of exactly what a given day required, an understanding built the same way every other skill in this whole household was built, through years of careful, attentive practice. There is a wider relationship, too, beyond this household's own private chapel, that shapes her position within the surrounding community, her family's connection to the parish church proper, standing perhaps a mile from the manor house itself, in the small village that has grown up over generations around her husband's estate and the tenant farms that support it. The family holds, as is common for a household of their rank, the right to present a candidate for the position of parish priest whenever the post falls vacant, a right called advowson, which sounds grand in the naming but functions in practice as one more ongoing responsibility rather than a purely honorary privilege, requiring careful judgment about which candidates might serve the parish well, judgment that ultimately reflects back on the family's own reputation within the wider community, just as surely as the condition of their own chapel does. They maintain, too, a designated family pew within the parish church itself, positioned prominently near the front, a physical, visible marker of status that every single villager attending Sunday service would recognize instantly, the same quiet, unspoken hierarchy we saw expressed through the Great Hall's salt cellar, simply extended outward now into the wider religious life of the entire community. Relations with the tenant farmers who work land under this estate, the same men whose boundary dispute occupied part of this morning's attention, extend well beyond simple landlord and tenant transaction too, into a whole web of mutual, if distinctly unequal, obligation that shapes daily life for dozens of families beyond the manor house's own walls. The household's charitable distributions we discussed earlier reach some of these same tenant families in genuinely hard seasons, the family's support during difficult harvests, occasional flexibility on rent when circumstances genuinely warrant it, though never simply given without careful consideration, builds the same kind of long-term social credit and stability that her correspondence with neighbouring gentry families builds at a different social level entirely. I think there is something worth noticing in how thoroughly interconnected this whole world actually was, every household, however grand or modest, woven into an extensive web of mutual obligation and expectation that extended outward in every direction, upward toward the crown itself, sideways toward neighbouring families of similar rank, and downward toward the tenants and labourers whose own daily work made the entire estate's prosperity possible in the first place. Her mourning, however privately and individually managed it might have felt from the inside, actually sat at the centre of an enormous, largely invisible network of relationships and responsibilities, each one requiring its own particular kind of careful ongoing attention, each one in its own way, one more thread in the vast, patient fabric that held this whole particular corner of Tudor England together. There is one last thread I want to gather up before we let this whole long morning finally settle into rest, and it concerns something we touched on only briefly, the particular quality of trust that had to exist between her and every single person we have met across these many hours together, because I think it is the quiet, invisible glue that actually held this entire elaborate structure in place. She trusts Joan with her own body, quite literally, every single morning, hands that lace her gown tightly enough to hold its shape, but not so tightly as to cause genuine discomfort across an entire day, hands that pin a headdress correctly, that comb out tangles without unnecessary pain, that have learned, across 8 years, the exact particular needs of one specific woman's daily care. She trusts Thomas with numbers that could, mishandled or misreported, quietly ruin this entire household across a single bad season, trusts him not simply because he has proven honest across 20 years of service, though he has, but because the whole system of wages and obligation and inherited position that binds his family to this estate gives him, in the end, as much reason to want this household to prosper as she has herself. She trusts Agnes with the health of everyone under this roof, trusts her judgment about when a fever needs only rest and when it needs a physician, trusts her with the keys to stores expensive enough that a less honest housekeeper could have quietly enriched herself across years of unnoticed small theft. None of this trust arrived automatically, simply because of rank or title or the formal structure of service that bound these people together. It was built the same way every other kind of competence in this house was built, slowly, through years of small tests passed and small confidences kept, through the accumulated weight of thousands of ordinary days, very much like this one, each one adding, almost imperceptibly, to a foundation of genuine, earned reliability. I think that is worth naming clearly, because it would be easy, looking back across 4.5 centuries at a household defined so visibly by rank and hierarchy, to imagine the relationships within it as purely transactional, purely a matter of obligation enforced from above. And there was genuine hierarchy here, genuine inequality of power and circumstance that I do not want to pretend away. But there was also, running underneath that hierarchy, something closer to genuine mutual reliance, dozens of people whose daily competence and whose daily trustworthiness made an entire complicated household actually function, day after day, season after season, in a world that offered very little margin for the kind of careless mistake or quiet betrayal that a lapse in that trust could invite. She could not have managed this morning alone, however capable she herself clearly was. No single person could have. What she managed instead was the careful ongoing coordination of dozens of other people's competence, each one trusted with their own particular piece of the household's functioning, all of it held together by her own steady attention, and underneath that attention, by years of patiently built, genuinely earned trust running in every direction at once. I want to spend a few final minutes, before we truly let go of this story, on something smaller and more intimate than households and trust and the wider architecture of Tudor society, and that is simply the particular texture of her own private thoughts across a morning this full, the small, half-formed reflections that would have run beneath everything else we have described, unspoken, unrecorded, but surely present nonetheless. There would have been, I imagine, a moment somewhere in the careful review of accounts with Thomas where her mind wandered briefly, despite herself, to her husband, wondering what exact room he occupied at that precise hour, whether the London lodging his family kept was warm enough against this same bitter cold, whether he had slept well or lain awake, as she sometimes suspected he did on difficult nights, turning over some delicate point of court politics that he would never trouble her with directly in a letter. There would have been, during the quiet stretch of needlework by the window, some small wandering thought about her own girlhood, a half-remembered afternoon in her mother's own household, stitching a sampler very much like the one her own daughter worked through this morning, the strange, quiet vertigo of realizing how completely the roles had reversed themselves across the span of a single generation. Small flickers of simple tiredness would have been there too, I suspect, unglamorous and entirely human. Moments where the weight of managing 40 people's daily needs pressed a little more heavily than usual, where some small, uncharitable thought about a servant's minor failing crossed her mind before she caught it and set it gently aside, because uncharitable thoughts, however quickly dismissed, are simply part of what it means to be a person managing other people's competence and occasional incompetence day after day, whatever century you happen to be doing it in. I mention all of this not because any of it appears in any historical record, since it could not, private thought being the one thing history genuinely cannot preserve directly, but because I think it matters to remember that a woman this competent, this thoroughly capable, was still, underneath all of it, simply a person, prone to the same small wanderings of attention, the same brief flickers of tiredness or irritation or wistful memory that fill your own days just as surely as they filled hers. The history books, when they bother with women like her at all, tend to flatten them into either pure competence or pure decoration, efficient household manager or beautifully dressed ornament, rarely both, and almost never anything as complicated and as simply human as a woman whose mind wandered, sometimes, in the middle of important business, toward her husband's comfort in a cold London lodging, or her own mother's hands guiding a needle decades before, or nothing in particular at all, simply the ordinary, unremarkable drift of a tired, capable mind moving through an ordinary, demanding day. Let me offer you one more piece of this world before we finally close the curtains on it entirely, something I find myself genuinely fond of whenever I research households of this particular period, and that is the sheer, patient ingenuity involved in simply keeping a house like this one lit and warm through the darkest stretch of an English winter, since we have mentioned candles and fires throughout this whole morning, without ever quite pausing to appreciate how much careful calculation sat behind something as simple as a room being lit at all. Beeswax candles, the finer kind burned in her own chambers and in the chapel, are made from wax collected across the summer from the estate's own beehives, kept in a quiet corner of the garden specifically for this purpose, rendered and purified through a careful process overseen, again, by Agnes and her still room, then dipped repeatedly, layer upon painstaking layer, around a length of twisted linen wick, each candle representing perhaps a full hour of someone's careful, repetitive labour before it is ever lit for the first time. Tallow candles, cheaper and considerably more common throughout the rest of the house, are made instead from rendered animal fat, a byproduct of the household's own butchering, smokier and considerably less pleasant in their smell, but produced far more cheaply and in far greater quantity, burned freely in the servants' quarters and the working parts of the house where the finer beeswax simply could not be justified. I think about the actual math of this sometimes, the careful daily calculation of exactly how many candles a household this size actually requires to get through a single winter night without waste, exactly how many hours of beeswax versus tallow light each room genuinely needs, exactly how that calculation shifts across the seasons as the nights themselves grow longer or shorter. It is the kind of invisible, unglamorous arithmetic that underlies almost everything we have discussed this morning. The food stores, the firewood, the linen, the wages, each one representing its own small patient exercise in foresight and careful proportion, each one, together, forming the actual invisible skeleton that let a household like this one function smoothly enough that its wealthier members could focus their attention on accounts and letters and children's education rather than on the constant, exhausting math of pure daily survival. There is something genuinely worth admiring in that whole system, honestly. The more time I spend sitting inside it with you tonight, not the wealth itself, though the wealth was certainly real and certainly considerable by the standards of its time, but the patient, careful competence required to actually manage that wealth well, to turn raw resources, wool and grain and wax and firewood, into a household that ran smoothly enough to absorb an absent husband, a political uncertainty, a servant's fever, and a boundary dispute all within a single ordinary morning, without ever once genuinely threatening to come apart at the seams. We have, I think, genuinely earned our way back to rest now, and I want to bring you there slowly, gently, the way she herself would eventually be brought there tonight, one small closing image at a time, rather than all at once. Picture the whole house once more, in its complete and settled shape, every room we have walked through together this morning now sitting quietly in its own particular kind of evening stillness. The bedchamber, curtains drawn, fire banked low, tapestry watching over an empty bed not yet occupied but waiting, patiently, for the night's rest still to come. The chapel, its single candle extinguished now until tomorrow's dawn calls it back into service, the worn kneeling cushion holding, faintly, the shape of this morning's prayer. The small room behind the hall, ledger closed and locked away, the single candle that lit this morning's accounts long since gone dark. The kitchens, quieter now than at any point since 3 o'clock this morning, banked fires holding their heat through the night, ready to be coaxed back to full life again long before the rest of the house even stirs. The long gallery, moonlight now instead of the pale grey daylight that filled it this afternoon, portraits watching over an empty corridor, the small virginal in its corner silent until some future afternoon calls it back into use. The still room, its careful stores locked and accounted for, Agnes's remedies waiting patiently on their shelves for whatever illness or minor injury tomorrow might bring. The stables, warm with the low, steady breathing of a dozen horses settled for the night, a stable boy making his own final rounds before he too finally allows himself rest. The gardens, bare and silent under whatever stars a January sky might offer through scattered winter cloud, holding, invisibly, the whole patient promise of a spring still months away. And somewhere at the centre of all of it, the woman whose entire morning we have walked through together, finally, fully at rest herself, the accounts settled, the letter answered, the fever broken, the boundary dispute resolved, her children fed and taught and cared for, her household's poor provided for, her husband delayed but coming home, a whole complicated, demanding, thoroughly competent day finally, gently complete. I want you to let that same completeness settle over you now too, whatever your own day carried before you found your way here tonight. Whatever needed managing has been managed, as well as it could be managed, for today. Whatever waits tomorrow can wait, genuinely, until tomorrow actually arrives. For tonight, there is nothing more required of you than exactly this: resting, breathing slowly, letting the whole weight of a day, any day, finally set itself down. One last practical detail deserves mention too, about how a household like this one prepared itself specifically for the passage into night, since we have spent so much of tonight on the morning's opening rituals and comparatively little on the quieter, less dramatic rituals that closed each day in turn. A final round is made each evening by one of the senior manservants, checking that the main door is properly barred, that the fires throughout the working parts of the house have been banked correctly rather than left to burn unattended, that nothing has been left carelessly out that damp or vermin or simple neglect might spoil overnight. It is unglamorous work, rarely if ever mentioned in any account of a great household's daily life, and yet every bit as essential in its own quiet way as the account-keeping and the accounts and the careful morning management we spent so much time with earlier. A house this large, holding this much stored wealth, this many vulnerable stores of food and cloth and coin, could not simply be left to itself overnight without this same kind of careful, deliberate closing down, mirroring, in its own practical way, the same careful opening up that begins every single morning here. I find something quietly satisfying in that symmetry, the way a day in this household both begins and ends with the same kind of careful, attentive checking. Curtains opened at dawn and doors barred at dusk, fires coaxed to life in the morning and banked low again at night, the whole household moving through its own daily cycle of opening and closing, waking and resting, held together, start to finish, by exactly the kind of patient, unglamorous attention we have spent this entire morning learning to notice and appreciate. There is a particular stillness that settles over a great house like this one in the deepest hours of the night, well past the point where even the latest working servant has finally found their own rest, and I want to describe it for you one final time, because I think it is exactly the kind of stillness worth carrying with you as you yourself drift towards sleep tonight. It is not silence exactly, not the complete empty silence you might imagine. A house this large, built from thick stone and heavy timber, never falls entirely quiet, not really. There is the faint, occasional creak of old wood settling against the night's dropping temperature, the same familiar sound she has learned across 14 years to find comforting rather than alarming. There is the low, distant sound of wind finding whatever small gaps remain around old windows and doors, a sound that would have alarmed her perhaps in her very first winter in this house, and that has become, across so many repeated nights since, simply the ordinary voice of the building itself. There is, somewhere far off, the muffled sound of a dog, one of the estate's working animals, shifting in its sleep in the stable yard, a small, warm, living sound in the middle of all that stone and cold. And beneath all of it, I think, there is the deeper, less audible sound of an entire household's collective rest, 40 people, more or less, all breathing slowly in their own separate beds and trundles and pallets, all held together, even in sleep, by the same careful structure of duty and care that shaped every single one of their waking hours too. Joan a few feet from her mistress, Agnes in her own small chamber near the kitchen, Thomas in his cottage at the estate's edge, his own wife and children breathing quietly around him, Father Whitmore in his rooms near the chapel he guards so carefully. 40 separate lives, 40 separate versions of rest, all somehow held within the single, larger shape of one particular household, one particular estate, one particular corner of a cold English county in the winter of 1540. I think there is something quietly extraordinary in that image, honestly. The more I sit with it, an entire small community held together not by any single dramatic act, but by thousands of small, patient, competent decisions made across years and years of ordinary days, very much like the one we have spent together tonight. And I think, whatever considerably different shape your own life takes, whatever considerably different community or family or simple quiet household surrounds you tonight, there is some version of that same held, patient togetherness present in your own rest too, whether you have ever quite thought to name it that way before or not. There is a version of tomorrow already forming, faintly, in the back of her mind even now, the way tomorrow always begins to form in the quiet close of any full, demanding day. She will need to speak with Agnes about the coming week's charitable distribution, given the season's particular hardship. She will need to check that the roof repair has actually begun as promised, weather permitting. She will need to finish the letter to Lady Featherstone she has been meaning to write. None of it presses urgently tonight. All of it waits patiently, gathered quietly at the edge of her thoughts, the way a household's whole accumulated business always waits at the edge of a capable person's mind, even in the deepest, most settled hours of rest. I think that particular quality, the mind's quiet, background awareness of tomorrow's shape, even while the body rests fully in tonight, is something else worth naming as we come to our own close, because I suspect it lives in your own mind too, some faint, unfinished thread of tomorrow's own demands, present even now, even as you lie here listening to this story, instead of actively managing anything at all. Let it wait there quietly if it must, the way her own unfinished business waits quietly at the edge of her own settling mind. It does not need solving tonight. It only needs to be gently set down, trusted to still be there, waiting patiently, whenever you actually need to pick it back up again. One more small piece of this world is worth offering before we let it rest completely. Something about the particular relationship this household held with the changing seasons of the church calendar itself, since it shaped the rhythm of so many ordinary days beyond just this one January morning we have spent together, and I think it deserves a final few minutes before we close the curtains entirely. The year, for a household like this one, was never simply divided into the 12 months a modern calendar might suggest. It was shaped instead by a whole overlapping structure of religious observance, feast days and fast days, and the great seasonal markers of Advent and Christmas and Lent and Easter, each one carrying its own particular set of expectations for food, for dress, for the kind of entertainment or restraint considered appropriate. Christmas itself, still some months distant from this particular cold January morning, though not so distant that its memory has fully faded, brought considerable feasting and warmth into this house, the great hall filled with guests and music and food considerably richer than the modest mutton and pottage of an ordinary working day, a whole season of genuine celebration built into the depths of the year's darkest, coldest stretch, as though the household understood, instinctively, that the harshest season needed its own deliberate counterweight of warmth and light and gathered company. Lent, still some weeks ahead in the calendar from this particular morning, would bring the opposite rhythm entirely, weeks of restraint, meat set aside in favour of fish and simpler fare, a whole household adjusting its daily table together in observance of the same shared religious rhythm that shaped so much else about how time itself was understood and organised in this period. She has already begun thinking, in the back of her mind this quiet afternoon, about the practical provisioning that Lent will require, the salted and dried fish that will need to be secured well in advance, the adjustments to the kitchen's usual routine that Agnes will need to plan for carefully. I think there is something worth noticing, one final time, in how thoroughly this whole rhythm of feast and fast, celebration and restraint, shaped not just her own household's religious life, but its entire practical calendar, its food stores, its social gatherings, its very sense of what kind of day any particular day actually was. Time, in this world, was never simply neutral, one identical day following another in mechanical succession. It carried meaning, texture, a whole inherited rhythm of sacred and ordinary that shaped in ways both large and small absolutely everything we have walked through together this morning, from the prayer that opened her day to the quiet, settled rest that will eventually close it. These final quiet minutes keep returning me to that single image of curtains closing around a bed, because I think it holds, in its own small way, almost everything this whole long morning was actually about. A boundary drawn gently and deliberately between the demands of a full and complicated life and the simple, necessary permission to finally rest from it. She drew that boundary every single night of her adult life, Not because the demands themselves ever fully disappeared. They did not. They were waiting again the very next morning. Curtains opened instead of closed, but because she understood, the way I think most genuinely competent people eventually come to understand, that rest itself was not a failure to keep managing, not an abandonment of duty, but simply the other necessary half of duty, the half that makes all the rest of it sustainable across weeks and months and years, rather than just a single unsustainably demanding day. That permission, given freely and without guilt, night after night, across an entire demanding life, is perhaps the single quietest and most important skill she ever learned, quieter even than the accounts, quieter than the careful management of servants and stores and correspondence, and every bit as necessary to a life sustained across years rather than simply survived across days. I hope, whatever your own version of that boundary looks like tonight, whatever curtain or blanket or simple closing of your own eyes marks the edge between your own day's demands and your own night's rest, that you can draw it now with the same quiet permission she gave herself every single night across an entire full and demanding life. You have done what needed doing today, as well as you could do it, with whatever competence and care you actually had available to bring to it. That is enough. It was always going to be enough, whatever quieter voice inside you might sometimes suggest otherwise. One last breath before we go then. In and out, slow and unhurried, the way a whole house finally exhales once its last small task has been completed and its last door properly barred against the night. Let your own breath match that same slow, settling rhythm now, if it wants to. There is nowhere else you need to be, nothing else you need to do, no further thread of this story left to hold. The house is settling now, fully, into its own deep winter night, and I think it is time for us to settle too, to let this particular morning, this particular woman, this particular cold January day in 1540 finally rest undisturbed until some other night calls it back into telling. She sleeps now, curtains drawn, fire banked, a whole household breathing quietly around her in the dark, the tapestry's frozen hunt keeping its own silent, patient watch above her, the same way it always has, the same way it always will, night after night, long after this particular cold January morning has folded itself gently into memory. I hope you find your own way there too, gently, unhurried, exactly as ready as you need to be. Whatever tomorrow holds for you, it can wait until tomorrow actually arrives, exactly the way tomorrow's demands waited quietly at the edge of her own settling mind tonight. Rest now. That is the only task left. Rest now, fully, the way a whole household finally rests, one careful, patient day at a time. Sleep well, friend. I will be here again next time, whenever you are ready for another story. For now, let this one go. Let the curtains close. Let the whole day, hers and yours both, finally, fully rest.